Hello, friends. My name is Steve, and happy Friday. And it is the Friday Conversation, episode 80. Here are some friends, and to discuss, we're going to be discussing the Trader Baru Cormont today. It's our November book of the month, so we'll be loosely talking about that. We had some plans, but we're still waiting. We had some guests, but things happen, so we're gonna just kind of find stuff to talk about until that guest arrives, hopefully. Anyway, Carl, will you start us off with introductions?
Yeah, my name is Carl Albert. I am an author. Just released a few months ago my first epic fantasy book, Truth of Crowns. And yeah, that's me.
Yes, and Layla.
I'm Layla Goushey. I am English professor, editor of Ballady magazine, and happy to say I just got my first editing project from a
Congrats.
writer, and I'm thrilled about that. So, but otherwise, keeping that under wraps.
That's good. This isn't going on the internet or anything, Layla, so you're fine.
Yeah.
No one will know.
Your secret's safe with us. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, congratulations, Layla. Happy for you.
Yeah.
And Paromita, you're back again. We haven't scared you away, so we're doing okay.
Yeah.
This is true. Hello, I'm Paromita. I'm a general reader. I'm a member of the Page Chewing Forum, and I have read all 3 published volumes of the Masquerade series, of which the first book is the Traitor Baru Cormorant. Mm-hmm. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for coming. It's always great to have you. And I don't know who let this guy in. Who are you again? What's your name?
My name is Chris Mohan. I sometimes have occasionally appeared on the Friday Conversation, and so
once or twice.
Always glad to have the opportunity. And I have to say, Traitor Baru Cormorant is harder to find in the UK than anywhere else, because it isn't actually called the Traitor Baru Cormorant. It's just called The Traitor. And I was like, oh, well, it's not that book. Because Traitor Baru Cormorant is such a cool name, right? Why would you want to change that to just The Traitor? You've taken all of its identity out. Although it does have a cool cover, admittedly.
Is the cover the same?
No, I think the artwork's different. Yeah, so it was, again, when I was looking for it, it was like, oh, well, maybe it is the same thing, because I didn't realise who the author was when I went searching for it. I just thought, this will be quite easy to find. I'd stick in this name, there'll be nothing else sounds like this. And I was like, oh no, this book isn't available in the UK, and then I had to go back and see who the author was, and then go, actually, this is the same book.
Nice. So just want to mention really quick that the Trader Baru Cormont is our November book of the month. We'll be meeting weekly to discuss it, and since Carl mentioned his book, it's this monster book that I have in my hand that nobody else can see but the people on this call. But it is Truth of Crowns. We'll be reading this in December and discussing it weekly as well. So looking forward to that. And if you're interested in joining us, visit our forums, and anyone's welcome. So Paromita, since you've read the book, what kind of non-spoilery preview can you give us? What are we in for?
I don't know how to do non-spoilers, but I'm trying. It is the story told from a first-person viewpoint of someone who has grown up a certain way, and that way of life has been destroyed and colonized by an entity known as the Empire. And it is about how this female protagonist, trains herself to be a part of the Empire and to hopefully fight back from within, and to bring down this institution that has robbed her of everything that she knew. And the main allure of this series, there are many, but 2 I will say. One is the tremendous interiority of the character, because we are in this person's head, and it is a very different type of character. I won't spoil more because readers will experience that when they start reading. And the second quite interesting thing is that apart from the usual military tactics, we see a lot of economic strategies being deployed to both by the empire to colonize the island which Baru grew up on, as well as when Baru becomes an agent when she strikes back. So that aspect was very interesting to read from a world building point of view, that it's not military, but it is actually how an empire sort of lays its claws into unsuspecting economies and gradually takes over all other parts of life.
And I've read it too, and I just want to jump in to say that it's the one of the really interesting things, kind of going off of what Paromita was saying, is how it's really about kind of the more subtle but equally insidious ways that imperialism and colonialism manifest themselves. That it's not all war, that like you can influence the currency, right, by getting your currency in and making that the de facto currency of a nation, by religious indoctrination, any number of factors. And it's really interesting to see, because it's not something I think fantasy fans are used to. It's definitely a lot of big battles in the Tolkien tradition, but there's also a lot of different other kind of perspectives on violence, I guess you could say, and evil, and power and control, and the main character is just phenomenal, and the prose is great, very unique. Seth Dickinson has a very unique writing style that I think, I don't know that everyone will love it, but I do think that if you enjoy more kind of literary, a little more, very much deep within the character, very subjectively written style, you'll enjoy it a lot, and where a lot of things are understated, or it's a style definitely fixated on subtleties, and that's often a pleasure. They definitely, it's a cool book.
Yeah. Something I thought of as I'm reading it, I'm about 2/3 the way through, I think. I'm reminded, the main character reminds me of Ren in the Poppy War in a way. And I've already said I like complex female characters. And so, not in all ways, but just, maybe the, the young person goes off to, to build herself, and, mayhem follows, as it does in all good books.
Well, I'm with you on that. I think there's a single-mindedness, a willing to do anything to pursue the end goals. That leads to a lot of pain and suffering, not only for other people but for herself. That I definitely think there's a lot of parallels there.
Yeah, and I'm glad to know it's the first of, I think, 3 books. Do I have that right? I'll have to check. But that there is, I haven't even finished this one, but that, this, hopefully, I don't know this yet, hopefully this character survives. If not, it's still a great, it's a great world. And so another thing I liked about it, I think, were the word choices and the names. I found it, unusual and original, some of the names for other characters and the world itself. And I always appreciate that.
It also seems to be a bit of a shot in the arm against, the criticisms of the genre that we love, that it's sort of low rent in some ways, and that it's only about kind of magic and dragons and whatever kind of thing. It never really has anything more meaningful to say. These kind of political fantasies challenge that that notion and do some of the more complex world building and kind of ideas generation
Yeah.
in that sphere, you know.
It definitely follows sort of modern trends too, in that it's like, you know, it has a lot of non-Western world building, you know, non-traditional kind of epic fantasy world building. There is some, but I would say by and large the influences are from Eastern cultures, whether it be Pacific Islanders, which is kind of the primary influence of the like the main character comes from an island culture, and is not white and is not straight. I think is worth mentioning. You know, if you're looking for queer fantasy, this is that. And it's also low magic. My understanding, I haven't read the later books, and I think we're expecting a fourth eventually, which I believe is
Yes.
supposed to be the last one. Yeah. I mean, Paromita can speak to this better, but I do believe more magic is introduced in later books, but there really, I don't think there's any in book one, if I remember correctly.
Yes, that is correct. Book one does not have any magic. I will hold off on commenting on the next two books because I think it is something to discover.
Okay.
Excited.
Yeah.
You know, I wanted to follow up on what Chris had mentioned about the title. So, Chris, have you read the book as
No,
well?
but I read the first
or-
page, and then somebody announced it as a November read along, and I thought we'll just park it for the moment.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm trying to remember actually if this was self-published, but I'm wondering if it was, why the author would have made those decisions. And,
As far as I know, it was not self-published. The US version is published by Tor. I am not sure. I am not sure who published the UK
okay.
books. I haven't checked that.
You know, I always wonder. I wonder if the more globalized we become, that will not be as, you know, much of an issue, because it just always seems to me like, you know, publishers are kind of saying, you know, we're not sophisticated enough to really get, you know, a title that an author has wanted for their book in their, you know, in their home country. I mean, I don't know, but in this case, I'm not sure. You know, it would be great to ask, you know, the author just what his intentions were, and yeah.
I was.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Actually, it's funny because when Professor Goushey was talking, when I was thinking about this book and I was thinking about what we could talk about, I actually prepared like this question for the entire panel, and the question was basically, what other books in fantasy with central female characters remind you, or you know, they have parallels with Baru in Traitor Baru Cormorant. And I was so sure that Professor Goushey would mention Rin, because she's in one of the because in one of the previous episodes she recommended this series, and she said that it is a part of a course that she's either going to be teaching or already teaching.
Yeah.
And so I mean, I just thought that was it was a very nice moment when Professor Goushey brought that up by herself, that, you know, I see this parallel between Baru and Ren. It was like, yay, we have this like telepathic thing going on. But I would love to ask this question to everyone else as well. And I have a guess for Steve, and I have a guess for Carl. Chris, I am not sure enough to have a guess, but I have a guess. I mean, I have a question. I have this question for everyone: that what female characters, or what complex female characters in other fantasy series sort of have moved you in the same way that Baruch Cormorant has moved us? It was a very moving experience to read about her. So, which
Yeah.
other POV has done that for you?
And but before giving an answer, I want to just emphasize the moving aspect. This is a really emotional book, and it's a really heavy book. It is very dark. And while there are definitely, it's a continuing story, it does have an arc, and it is it's a tragic story. So definitely something to keep in mind when going in. You definitely want to be in the right headspace. But sorry, going off of Paramita's question, y'all can go for it.
Who wants to go first? Okay.
I guess
Team.
Go ahead, Carl.
Carl, go ahead.
Well, the first character that popped into my head is Felison from Malazan, as both someone who does terrible things in the pursuit of. I think Baru has higher ideals than Felison does. I mean, there's definitely pretty significant differences, but there still is a sense of like, doing things for self-preservation and to forward one's goals. A cold-hearted pragmatism. Very Machiavellian. They're very different in some ways, but beyond all that, Felison, her story over the course of the books in the Malazan book, The Fallen, that she appears in, I found very moving and was one that I just really thought was phenomenal and also very dark, very, very dark. Rin is another good example. I haven't read all of the Poppy War books, but I want to second that again, that I think actually of all of the characters I can think of, Rin really, I feel like there's a lot of parallels there in terms of just like, the way she pursues the world. I guess the big difference I would say is Baru is subtler as a character, and I don't even mean like Rin's a force of nature almost, like Rin pursues things doggedly and very clearly and is very outspoken a lot of the time, while Baru is, the series is called The Masquerade. And if I remember correctly, it's been a year or year and a half since I read this book, maybe a couple years now, actually. That's the name of the empire. But it's also kind of the whole premise of Baru's pursuit is she is putting on a mask and pursuing the dissolution of this empire. And it's, it's an interesting, I guess, dichotomy between those two characters. But yeah, no, I'd love to hear anyone who pops into mind for everyone else.
Go ahead, Layla.
Actually, I have another one. I mean, I mentioned Rin, but in comparison, so I would say maybe I don't know if it's the opposite for Rue, but there's a book called The Priory of the Orange Tree. Has anyone
Yes,
The Shannon.
read
I
that?
have. Yes.
Yeah. And it's also about queer female characters. But the author is, the author takes it, I think, in a different direction. It's more of I think, a traditional hero story,
Yes.
where you have, again, the hero is set on this journey and comes and meets the queen, and but I'm reminded of that only because thinking how in fantasy we are starting to have gay characters, and how the authors are playing with those, playing with the tropes and the expectations. And I think Priory of the Orange Tree, I think the author, Samantha Shannon, I think she's done a great job with that one as well. And I think the difference so far is, in the book we're talking about right now, Beirut, it's more of I think it's not overt. Like in Priory of the Orange Tree, it's a full-blown relationship, that the character gets into. Whereas here, it just seems more like hints and shadows and it's all wrapped up you know, I'm trying to say this without giving too much away, but
Yes.
it's all wrapped up in the intrigue. You know, it's all wrapped up in just the risk that the character is facing and things like that. So
Because this is on top of that, this is not like a going off of that and kind of without giving any plot details. These are homophobic societies, and so this isn't a fantasy where like gay characters are accepted. Like this is very much a world where, well, actually, I mean, I don't think this is a spoiler because it's like page 1, but where Baru comes from, they are accepted, and it's she has like polyamorous parents. She has 2 dads and a mom, and so she comes from a background where as a kid that was normalized, and then suddenly she enters this society where it's like she could be killed, she could be mutilated for who she is, and certainly things happen developing that.
yeah.
Chris, what comes to your mind?
So what comes to my mind, because all I'm really working off here is archetypes that everybody else has ascribed here. So the one that springs to mind for me, and I'll qualify it by saying, like, she's very much what seems to be a much more blunt instrument for most of the journey of the series of the books, and then becomes more nuanced as she gets older and matures and understands herself better, would be Iskara Helsing from The War Eternal by Rob J. Hayes. Those ones. She is a character that is very difficult to like, I think intentionally, because of how blunt and how she sees and can affect the world and who she is. But as she becomes older and becomes a mother and all of these things, the nuances of her motivations and what she thinks she's doing and what's right and wrong, and again how her power is diminishing at the same stage but still very important for the world, is kind of one of the most fascinating parts of that entire book. Because, like, honestly, there are parts of that 5-book series that you're going, I hope she dies. She's the main character who the first it's first person the whole way through, basically in her head, and she's so unlikable and she's so angry at the world, and she wants to create vengeance against all the things that have been held for her that she's hard to root for all the time. But she always just gives you just enough to kind of give you that crumb of to say, look, there's redemption for this person. There's a way back for them, hopefully, out of it. And, a lot of the series of books is about her journey and how we change as people and all of that kind of stuff as we go older. So that's the one that seems to spring to mind based on the kind of things that everybody else is talking about.
That absolutely sounds a lot like Baru. She's not always easy to like. Definitely not.
Yeah, for me, I think the first one comes to mind is Rin, because I know we're in the minority, Layla. And a lot of people don't like Rin, but I don't know. I won't give too much away, but it made sense to me why she did what she did. Okay. Without getting into specifics, it made sense. But and then of course Falison is another one that comes to mind. The two that I kind of thought of as everyone was talking was Rune from the Rift Cycle series. The first book is Edge of the Breach by Halo Scott. That character, I think, how she deals with loss, and she's a very rounded character. She's not only this fierce warrior, but she's also has a soft side and also like this really crude humor side. It feels like a person. It feels like it's not just a one-dimensional character. Lots of sides to her, and the journey that she takes by the end of that series is great. But the other one that I thought of is Taylor from The Winter Road by Adrian Selby. Again, it's about loss and grief and love and getting older and just life, like dealing with changes, and what may be important to you today may not be as important to you years from now, but you still have an appreciation for it. Just kind of the journey we all take and looking back on things that it's a really touching story, really really violent and dark and bleak at times, but just a fantastic book. Layla and I read the Brother Red together, but The Winter Road is fantastic also. So anyone looking for great female characters, some great recommendations here for those.
And I'd be a bit remiss if I didn't mention, although it doesn't seem to be as conflicted, would be Mara from the Empire trilogy as well, by Jami. My actual favourite character, but she's not as complex or as twisted that she's just incredibly smart, but is fighting against the system, which doesn't really, a bit like people are saying, it's a homophobic society. She's fighting against a society that's very anti-female. The females have her own society, and she has to win over despite those odds, and convince people to do things when their inclination is like, you're a woman, and a very young woman at that.
It's interesting. I'm sitting here thinking of it, like trying to think of more characters who remind me of Baru, that I feel like the sort of perspective we get from her is either, I feel like, the sort of infiltrating the evil empire and like tearing it down from the inside, I feel like is often something we get from a male perspective, or otherwise, the sort of female political actors, I feel like are very rarely our point of view characters. Or often they're like villains, like Cersei Lannister, who is certainly nowhere near as smart as Baru, who is like a genius. But it is interesting to have that sort of like insider, female political actor character who is like the main character, the driver of the story. Because, so often I don't know that that's necessarily I feel like they're often supporting characters or villains. It's interesting.
Yeah. I want to give some kudos to Robert Jordan, who wrote The Wheel of Time, because although he did not have, a primary female character, he did draw what I would say are prototypes, and I even hate to say that because, like Egwene going into the, becoming the Amerlin seat. First, she's the rebellion, she's in the rebellion and ends up as the Amerlin seat. And she had a pretty strong drive for power in the story. I mean, she really was all about ambition and power. He's just very, he's very subtle. He didn't make it as blatant. He wrote, I think he really wrote sort of for, I hate to say, I don't think it was a different time in the 50s and all that, because it wasn't, he wrote this much later than that, but he seemed to kind of write like he had a 50s audience or something. Where he didn't come right out and say, this person is maniacally hungry for power, and even polyamory. I mean, that's another one. So just as we're talking about all this, I'm thinking, I think he tried, if that makes sense, and he succeeded, but it was much more subtle than the stories that we're seeing today. And I like what we're seeing today.
Egwene was, I'm with you. Egwene was one of the characters who popped into my head as like very ambitious, right. Definitely a political player. And it is, she's certainly couched as being more heroic oftentimes, and it's understated, I think, kind of some of the terrible things she does. I love Egwene, but she definitely, particularly in the latter half of the series, does some things that you're like, was that necessary? Like, you're maybe being a little petty or a little needlessly, cold, and she was sort of almost a prototype for this type of character.
Yeah,
you've got to give credit to Wheel of Time, because I think for all the things I can say about it, it is a world where it's a females have the power within the world, and actually the male is much described as being toxic by just being male, in its own right, as a very advanced construct for when those books were written, if that makes sense. It's things that people have made a big deal about later, but kind of subtly just saying, female are good and have the power, and they will make the decisions for people about what is good and bad. They kind of make that dividing line for everybody. My question about it is, especially for these kind of characters that we're talking about, when people are writing, because it's often male writers writing, do they just describe masculine characteristics and put them in a female form, or are they actually still inherently feminine in one right? do you know what I mean? Is it just a simple case of just taking the power hungry things and the archetype that would be male and just saying they're in actually in a lot of cases a teenage female body, and then just that's enough to adjust that, or is there more subtlety about it?
You know, I think about that sometimes, and I do think as readers, if we're told a character is male or female, I think we kind of have this, you know, we have this generosity toward the writer that, okay, we know this is a male character or female character, and so we're going to make certain assumptions unless I'm told otherwise, you know, unless a detail. But there are situations where things are just obvious, a little bit too obviously wrong. And I'll bring up Robert Jordan again. I mean, he did make a lot of, you know, very unwise references, I think, you know, to women's chests and all of that.
And braids.
You know, but it doesn't kill the story, you know, and although it does for some people. I mean, you know, for some folks that's enough for them to put it down. But I sort of, first time I ever read it, I just sort of like, you know, was interested in the story and kept going. But now I just sort of, I think I'm the same way. I give it as a person who had was trying to do right, but was awkward in how he delivered it. So I think what's interesting about Wheel of Time Twins is it's like we know all the issues, but we still like the story. You know, even with all else that's in there.
How much of that is when it was written for everyone? Do you take that into consideration? Is it just of the time, and do you let some things go, or does it still bother you?
A little of both, I think. I mean, I don't know, you know, the exact ages of everyone here, but I was born at the end of the 20th century. You know, I'm 26 years old. And so definitely to me read as like, oh, this is an older work. And it was a thing I struggled with, you know, particularly the like that it's baked into the world. Like that was the thing that I really struggled with. I started reading it as a freshman or sophomore in college. And I was like, oh, the whole Sidene and Sidar, like being like inherent, and the way that you have to use it is inherent to, you know, the sex you're born with, and like, you know, that men have to like conquer it and women have to submit and all of that. Like, even though the characters themselves, and I think that's what ultimately made me look past it, was I felt like the characters themselves were rich enough and complex enough that, and the world building was interesting enough, you know, and the story went in interesting directions that I could look past it. But there definitely are some things where you're like, oh, this is very much, you know, this was a series started in the 1980s, like, you know, it is a bit of its time. But I think you could say the same thing even of a more recently written series of like, you know, A Song of Ice and Fire, that I think it's maybe not in like a magic system per se, but certainly some of the ways that like men and women are presented, and even like notions of patriarchy are presented in a very like, you know, we're continuing to evolve and grow, and, you know, cultures change, perceptions change. And so I do think it's certainly going to be a stumbling block for people. I mean, I know I struggled with it, but if you can have some compassion, I think, for the author, you know, and be like, you know, he was trying to do something. I think, especially as I go back and reread the books, it's clear to me that he was trying to write something that had a very progressive message, and one actually that I think is still the overall message of balance, I think, is one that is still very impactful and very needed. I mean, particularly in a world that's, you know, increasingly polarized, that there's a level of like, you know, nuance to some of the things that it isn't immediately clear. Like a lot of what Layla was saying, I think is really interesting, that like, you know, almost writing for like a 1950s audience, where like a lot of the kind of some of the really complex stuff he was going for was couched in a lot of maybe seemingly more traditional, gender roles and things like that, and like, subverting them in different ways. And I don't know, there's a degree to which I think you have to like maybe dig a little deeper into some aspects of it to kind of see what he was doing. Like a specific thing that comes to mind for me is the way that like men are all treated as like irrational and emotional and things like that, where like very much the the stereotype of the time was that like, women are the ones who are I mean, that's still a thing you hear today, and men are like cold and like pragmatic and rational, and ambitious, for example, and women are all very emotional and soft-hearted and nurturing and that sort of thing. And the series intentionally, I think, once you realize like, okay, so all the women are like criticizing like Rand and Matt and Perrin for being like emotional and bullheaded and not thinking clearly, like he's intentionally making a point of how stupid that is in real life when we paint a whole swath of people as being fundamentally irrational or fundamentally broken, fundamentally incapable of leading, and that's something that I think has actually aged well, even if the way it's sometimes approached is a little shaky or odd by maybe modern standards.
Yeah, I think for all authors, I mean, I really think there's a before internet, after internet way of reading authors, and then the mid 90s and forward is kind of that transitional time, but even George R.R. Martin, I think, is about the same generation.
Absolutely.
And so I think, like in Robert Jordan's case, he was probably, just a typical American kid that ended up in Vietnam and sort of got exposed to Eastern philosophies in one way or another, and also PTSD, which is a big theme. And so, I think he was trying to slide a lot of different, just what you said. And even more toward the end of his life, I know, like, about LGBT characters. He said something about, well, I can't remember the exact quote, but pillow friends. You can make your own assumptions or something like that. So, no, I think what he said was that he considered that there were gay characters in the book, but it wasn't something where the character declared it. It was just like, part of their, just part of whatever else they were doing. So I think he was trying to, like, not just trying, I think he did tried to have a wide variety of characters and ethnicities and races as well, So yeah, I think he was in his own way progressive, but when you just have, the evening news to rely on, and maybe your own little circle, it's not the same as today where you can just access any viewpoint.
That's a great point. And just to like, again, hammer home that like, I don't think this is just a Robert Jordan issue, because I do think he's given a really hard time. And some of that is because I think it's, baked into kind of this story he was telling in a way, again, with the magic system and everything, that George R.R. Martin, like, and the Song of Ice and Fire books are like among my favorite fantasy books ever. So I adore George, I love all of that work. But when he also, kind of tried to subtly include gay characters. He was trying to be open-minded and include, all the varieties of people we see in real life. He had Renly Baratheon, one of the main gay characters in the series. His special King's Guard when he was a king was the Rainbow Guard. They were all rainbow. That was his way of where you look at that now and you're just like, like really, like that's what we're going for, like the rainbow guard. And it's, you know, it's just one of those things that, like, you know, they're men of their times. And like, I think the thing that to be acknowledged is that, like, the heart of it is like, is that, you know, they're you know, that Renly Baratheon is like a well-rounded character, and like Loras Tyrell is a well-rounded character, and, you know, getting into the later books, John Connington, and even if it's not, you know, if parts of us like cringe a little bit in the modern day with the internet and everything, you know, I mean, I think Layla's spot on. The internet certainly can't be understated how impactful that is and has been.
I think I see this a lot in, like, even very modern things. When people were writing TV dramas and movies, and they were like, right, we've got to make reference to COVID. By the time those things came out and they were on the screen, often they were a little too on the nose, in much the same way as you're talking about the radio guard, or people that are too close to it and go, I can't watch this because of its attempt to either shoehorn this in or make something, you know, it's a bit too close to home or something. And I wonder, you know, going forward another 10-15 years, maybe people will find that more palatable as a historical artifact, rather than kind of, we've just come out of this period. The same with Me Too and stuff. Some things did very well, and some things it was just, this is just cheap in a lot of ways, and actually cheapens the thing that we've got. So I often think it's very important, though, because this happens a lot with films. You know, films are made in historical context, and they often come up to start, this film is representative of the views of the time. So things like blackface, etc. People say, oh no, I couldn't watch a film with blackface, but I think that still has an importance, because it's only through looking through that lens and watching that you kind of appraise it on your own way, if you know what I mean. You know, you kind of make your own judgment call. Well, that does make me feel uncomfortable. It does, rather than kind of banning it or censoring it or anything like that. I think it's much more important and impactful to keep it in and then have the discussion and the discourse about it, than just kind of saying it should be taken out. That's not right. That doesn't fit with modern society.
Yeah, I mean, you can't learn from history if you don't acknowledge it. You know, you don't teach it. And like, and again, there are good things. So like, it's not like, you know, 100 years ago nobody had like good ideas, you know, or 500 years ago, you know, there were good people. Like, you know, even if there's stuff, you know, like certainly segregation, terrible, horrible. A lot of attitudes people had back then, bad. But like, you can still, like, a lot of our philosophical ideas we look at today are still like, were invented, you know, thousands of years ago. So it's worth, you know, being open-minded and like not just, I agree, trying to erase something just because it makes us uncomfortable.
Yeah, you know, even recently, I've been kind of looking into the whole idea of solar punk and, you know, positive climate futures and that type of writing, you know, poetry and stories and so on. But so I came across this one article about Ursula K. Le Guin and a book she's written called The Disappearance, which I have never read, but apparently, you know, they were recommending that as like, you know, she was ahead of her time, and it's solar punk before her time. And so now, of course, I had to check that out and put that on my TBR as well. But you know, in a sense, you know, there, sometimes it's not that people are ahead of their time, which they are, but that I think in human society, the themes are there. People continue to represent those themes as just what is noticed and recognized at the time. And so that's what always encourages me as a writer, is just, you know, keep writing and keep doing what you do, because maybe, you know, 100 years from now somebody will notice, you know, but and it's just always important for us to share our ideas and our you know, perspectives in that way. And so, but back to the whole idea of 60s and 70s writers, I, again, that just reminded me how rich and prolific sci-fi fantasy was at that time, and how forward-thinking some of the writers were in it. So, yeah, pretty cool. But we are now too. Folks are now too. So.
Absolutely. I was just going to say, have you guys read Ursula K. Le Guin? because I think she was definitely someone who was ahead of her time. I mean, you look back and a lot of her ideas, you know, it's like our stuff we're like really coming around to now and are becoming more, you know, if not mainstream, well, certainly more mainstream, just more widely discussed. And her prose style is beautiful, definitely a little more old school. But generally, like her sci-fi and fantasy both are just like we're way ahead of their time.
Right, right. I agree.
Steve, I was going to have a stab at answering your question. So you asked whether when there's a fantasy series, and you specifically asked about Wheel of Time, whether one is able to ignore the issues or give it a pass, or it's still a problem. So I have read the 14 books of Wheel of Time, and for me, it was a problem from book 1 itself, and I do not give it a pass, or I'm unable to give it a pass. The reason was very much, oh, I should say, because I think Carl is right, this is relevant to our discussion. I'm in my early 30s. 1990, Eye of the World came out. 1990, Tehanu came out by Ursula K. Le Guin, which is the 4th book in the Earthsea cycle. 18 years after she published her 3rd volume of the Earthsea trilogy initially, which was called The Farthest Shore. And in this book in 1990, in the foreword, she says, "Why was I, as a woman author, writing about men? This is my attempt to see what Earthsea looks like to women, to children, to the elderly, to the people who do not have power." This book came out in 1990, and Eye of the World came out in 1990. If Ursula K. Le Guin can retcon her own message, can correct her own in-world message, and publish a book to that effect, despite being such a respected author in 1990, why was nothing done when the Wheel of Time series took off?
That's a great question.
Same tropes. I mean, I'm not saying that. I mean, absolutely more power to anybody who enjoys the book, but I found it tiring, and I was like, I just want to read Tehanu because both came out. Forgotten Beasts of Hell, 1973, Patricia McKillip, female protagonist, very quiet, very fairy tale-ish, but a lot of good theming. And in Wheel of, even, I mean, forget, you know, because then you come into this question that, okay, so female authors. No. Memory Sorrow Thorn came out in 1988. I think the final volume came out in 1993, which is a trilogy. 100 times better, in my opinion, in writing, in theming, in every single aspect, including the gendering aspect. So it was very, very, and I understand why Wheel of Time is so beloved. It's probably like the Harry Potter for when I was growing up. Like a book was coming out every 2 years, and it was also with the onset of the internet, and so there was online forums with the theories. But as someone who has access to all 14 books and who can just read them back to back, it was very disconcerting. A Song of Ice and Fire, I would also agree. I think Martin writes very good female characters, but I'm deeply uncomfortable with the way he describes people's private parts of both genders.
I was going to say, I think the one thing you have to give Martin is I think he's weird about bodies all around. He definitely, I mean, I will say I do think he probably is a little weirder with women, but especially considering the young, like how young some of the girls that he writes about are. And I think that's one of certainly the most prominent criticisms that, you know, are widely made and appropriately so of his work.
I wonder how much of that is just not understanding and not having the avenues to explore that. Especially once he'd written the first book, a lot of the characters were sort of formed in quite strong way because, you know, Gwyn and Eve, etc., are very, very prominent through the first couple of books. And then at a certain point, when you mature and wish that you'd done something different, you're like, but this is where we are with this story. You know, I think I can ascribe or certainly forgive authors for being ignorant of it. You know what I mean? And not being there in their journey themselves. What Like I may look back at a 20 or 25-year-old version of myself and be horrified at some of my ideas and sensibilities, but that doesn't mean that there's no redemption for me, because life's a journey like that in terms of listening and understanding others.
I agree. And I agree very much, Chris. And this is why I think that the works themselves,
Yeah.
I do not have so much. I mean, they are what they are, and I felt what I felt. It is when the current fandom, or when parts of the current fandom who are sitting in the 21st century and they defend vociferously certain aspects of the text, and they sort of, you know, uh, I mean, one of the things is you read it wrong, which is fine, or actually this is supposed to do this, which is also fine, but it is an interpretation, it is not the interpretation. So that aspect hurts me more when readers of the 21st century very vocif. I can understand being attached to a work, but perhaps attachment to any form of art is not greater than sort of concern for our fellow human beings. So if someone is saying that something really bothered me, to shut them down or to bring this sort of defense, that is a bit hurtful to read in online forums or in
Yeah.
online discussions.
I wonder
Yeah.
how much. Yeah,
The
the
internet
internet sucks. Yeah, but there is like sort of. I actually just. I think an awful lot of this comes down to just. Oh God, I come to like capitalist society says that you're better if you win. You know that somebody has to be winner, has to write all the time, and I would be even open to saying that it's a very masculine kind of ideal to force your opinion and be right over somebody and describe they're wrong. But as you quite right to say, Paromita, as any kind of art, as soon as it leaves you, and I'm sure Carl described this as well, what somebody takes from the story, you can't tell them from that, because it is literally their experience of the reading experience, and regardless, so even if you had read it wrong, that was the experience that you had, and that's the way that it made you feel, so even if
Yes.
that was your argument, which I don't agree with in any way, it still doesn't change your experience of that and how the art communicated to you.
Yeah.
Um, I was going to say one thing because Carl and also Professor Goushey mentioned it, and she's very, very dearly beloved to me. In fact, today, just on a Discord server, people were asking for photographs of their authors, and I downloaded this picture of her, and I was remembering her again, Ursula K. Le Guin. So one of the things which happens a bit maybe is uh, she tends to be known in fantasy circles for Earthsea, but Earthsea is not her best work, in the sense the best book in Earthsea is the fourth book, according to me, where she really comes into her own. But this was an author who really, really took, as Carl said, as Professor Goushey said, who took speculative fiction to maximum limits possible. She did anything and everything that is possible with the pen, and it was solely through words. So she has the Hainish cycle, which is um, a series of connected standalones, but they can be read by themselves. The only exception I would say is The Birthday of the World, which is a collection of short stories. Before that, you would probably want to read Left Hand of Darkness. But Left Hand of Darkness, Dispossessed, even her last Hainish work, The Telling, it's like when I read it, I just wonder that we had such a person in our world, and we think so much about. I don't know whether you all also feel this. There's so much about this genre fiction does not get literary prizes and things like that. And I think that this person was around with us till 2018, and we missed an opportunity to give such a great contributor the Nobel Prize,
Mhm.
because
That's,
I have really seen the list of winners, and more power to all of them. But really, this was one lady who I think any praise and is not enough praise for what she did for literature, and then SFF literature. And she came guns blazing, saying, "I write science fiction, I write fantasy." I mean, till right until the end, when she there on YouTube, when she accepts her National Book Award medal from Neil Gaiman, she says, "I accept this on behalf of my entire community who have been denied these awards." and then she says a lot more as well. But it's some, like one of those human beings, you just wonder how and why did we miss honoring such a person. And it's a bit of a miss. I do miss her a lot. I wonder whether what she would think of the current times. I think she would have something to say about it. What do you think?
Oh, I think so too. And that's a lovely, testimony of her work that you've just given. And you're making me want to go get all those books again. Actually, seriously, putting it on my list here to think about over December maybe. But yeah, I agree with you. And, I guess I hate to say it, it could be she wasn't as recognized because of her, because she was a woman.
100%.
But she was recognized, definitely. I mean, she did have a big name in the genres, but
I go ahead, Paromita.
No, please go ahead, Carl.
All I was going to say was that, definitely her being, I'm sorry if you guys hear the motorcycle outside. The Ursula K. Le Guin was, I'm sure her being a woman impacted things, definitely impacted her sales. But in terms of like stuff like the Nobel Prize, that's the classic, like, SFF is a ghetto, and like, which is silly, right? Because it's like the most successful stories ever told are like SFF. If you look at Marvel movies, all SFF. You can even have more like higher, more complex stories.
Frankenstein, Dracula are essentially horror sci-fi stories in some way as well.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So it's silly, but that's definitely why. It's like when you write in the genre and you're open about it, like she was. I'm with you that like that how open she is and how she will criticize people who maybe shy away from the label. I love it. Certainly as someone who's grown up and identifies a lot with the genre. Oh, lovely surprise! Hey.
Oh,
we've been having
no
a great time.
Yeah, we've been chatting.
No problem.
Sure. Yeah, no worries.
Sure.
Oh, very nice. No worries.
Sure.
I brought my cat. My cat likes to like drink out of the sink and everything. I'm always fighting that, so I end up getting a little electronic water fountain. I don't know if anyone has seen that, and now she's avoiding the sink and she'll go to the water fountain. But
very good.
Yeah. So.
Professor Goushey, very quickly before Mr. Dickinson joins us and we start, a book I want to recommend to you and to everyone else as well if you haven't read it, but specifically to Professor Goushey because she likes poetry. Always Coming Home by Ursula K. Le Guin.
Oh, yes. I will, actually. Yeah.
It's a lovely book, and if you do pick it up anytime soon, please drop me a message. I would love to read it along with you.
I will. I read that a few years back, but I will definitely. You've given me some ideas, for a class I'm teaching as well. But call me Layla. You can call me Layla because we're just all
okay.
Yeah, we're just all here having fun. But I bring in poetry into my creative writing class, just all different kinds, and I think that's a lovely suggestion, actually.
She opens with such a beautiful one. It's so simple, and I don't understand poetry 90% of the time. But she always speaks to me somehow.
Here I am.
Yeah, welcome, Seth. Thanks. So those of you listening, Seth Dickinson was awesome. Thank you, Seth, for joining us.
Yeah, again, I'm sorry I was late. I just lost track of time. I can promise you that 70 minutes is not the latest I have been to a professional obligation. Last time I missed a podcast, I remembered I was supposed to be there just as I sat down in an IMAX theater to watch Interstellar.
I mean, you can't. That's a pretty good excuse.
I
mean, the podcast is probably going to be great, but it probably wasn't going to be Interstellar either. So yeah.
Should we do introductions?
Sure. Yeah. Carl, want to start us off again? Go for it.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I am Carl Albert. I am author of a recently released book, Truth of Crowns, an epic fantasy novel. Let's move on to Professor Goushey.
I'm Laya Goushey. I am an editor of Melody Magazine, and I write poetry and short stories.
And Paromita?
Hi, I'm Paromita. I'm a general reader. I'm a member of the Forum, and I have all volumes of my series, and I'm very thankful for the opportunity to be here.
And I'm Chris Mohan. Sometimes YouTubers, sometimes appear on the Friday Conversation and other things on other channels, and very excited to have the opportunity to discuss an upcoming read of mine that I read page 1 and then somebody told me to stop and wait for a few months until we can we can go again.
Who would do such a thing?
Indeed.
Yeah. And Seth.
I'm Seth. I'm the guest. I've written 5 novels. I've sold 5 novels, 4 of which I've written with Tor Books. And I've also worked on Destiny, Subnautica, some other science fiction and fantasy video game properties. And I live with 2 kittens and my partner in Brooklyn.
Yes. Yeah, so your book is our November book, so we'll be reading and discussing it that month. And thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, good month, November. One of my favorites.
Perfect. Yeah.
In the top 12.
Definitely. I grew up in Vermont, so autumn is when we get the beautiful foliage, and winter starts rolling in around then. I always just love that crisp sense of entropy and imminent death in the air.
Yeah, so everyone got quiet.
So what made you want to pick this book of all the many, many wonderful fantasy books out there?
Well, my friend Yolene gifted me a copy, and I gifted her a copy, and we had agreed to read it this year, and we had finally had a chance to plan it, and we planned for November, and I had to, we mentioned it on our forum, and had lots of people want to jump in, so we decided to make it our book of the month, and we'll be discussing it every week, and then we'll have a big discussion at the end when we finish. So, and everyone on the podcast today will be reading it with us.
Okay, I will avoid spoilers. Do you know about how the writing of the book was itself kind of a huge spoiler?
Oh no!
So the final chapter of the book is the first thing I ever published as a short story on Beneath Cecil Sky's magazine, which is a magazine that purely does secondary world fantasy, which means, as you probably know, like fantasy that's not set on Earth or in some fantastical version of Earth. So when the book came out, I had to go back to Scott Andrews and be like, could you put a spoiler warning at the top of the short story so that people who are Googling the book don't just read the short story? And yeah, I would encourage you to avoid it if you dislike spoilers. But there is an interesting issue where, like, should a book still be good if you know how it ends? I think yes. I think many of my favorite books hold up on reread. Mm-hmm. And it's just a weird fact of human cognition that you can know how something ends, but still, throughout the course of the book, hope or fear that it will end differently.
I have a question, just to clarify. Is it the victory chapter? Is it letters? Like which?
Victory, yes.
Victory. Yep. Okay, that's what I figured. That was going to be the question I had for you, because it's written in a different tense, and I was wondering, like, what, if there was I mean, I don't want to spoil anything, but I've read the book. I read it a couple of years ago. Loved it, and yeah, I was curious. So, was that just a matter of like the slightly different style? Was that because it was written as a short story, and then you came and decided on a slightly different voice, a slightly different style for the rest of it, or how did that come about? Was there, I was like, I was very curious about that.
So my feeling is that past tense offers a slight level of distance from the narration. One of the things people often don't like about present tense is that it kind of feels shallower and more rapid. There's not as much room for characters to just break into discursive thought or reflect on whatever's happening. Because past tense is kind of this implicit frame of somebody telling you something. So when we got to that end of the book, again, I'm not spoiling anything, but I did want the reader to feel subtly more vulnerable, like you'd ripped a layer of distance off the story and now you were in the present and anything could happen. Yeah, that was it. And of course, the short story being written first, being in past tense, or in present tense, just worked better for that chunk of story, I felt.
Very cool, thank you.
Do a lot of your... Sorry, go ahead.
I do have a small question, but I'm happy to wait. Please go ahead.
I was just going to say that a lot of times people who listen to fantasy podcasts are themselves hoping to write something, people with imagination, hoping to get published. So I did want to just briefly note that not only was the short story at the end the first thing I published, but it was not the first thing I tried to get published. I've been getting rejected for years before that. And while I love Beneath Ceaseless Skies, it's not like a top flight market in that its rejection rate is not that high. Something like Clark's World took me a lot longer to sell to. And even the book was not only rejected by a lot of agents, but something I really want to get through to people trying to go through this journey is that the same person can reject the story and then read it again a year later and love it. I had agents pass on the manuscript who then emailed me and were like, I must have been on crack. I don't know what I was thinking. That's a direct quote. I've had stories rejected by short story editors who then, after the story sold somewhere else, went on to put it in a year's best anthology. So to me, that's like armor against despair, You can't control how other people feel. It's all stochastic and crazy. You just gotta persist. Anyway, Paromita. You had a question?
Yes, I did. So actually, I have a few questions, but I'll start with one regarding the title. So just thinking about it, we have traitor, and we have monster, and then we have tyrant. One thing I was thinking is if somebody doesn't know anything about the book or hasn't read the synopsis, usually traitor, then maybe somebody becomes a tyrant, and then they become a monster in the sense first you get power and then that absolute power corrupts absolutely. In Baru's case, this trajectory is different. Was that something that you always knew, or was it something that evolved while writing?
Yeah, I always knew that, and there are many, many people who are monsters who do not have any particular power. And again, we got to avoid spoilers here, but a lot of the question of the second book, because each title is like a question, is she going to become this thing, is about how she treats other people. Like, you can be monstrous in your own life in how you treat others without having any particular worldly power over governments or economies. Everyone, maybe not everyone, but people have difficult relationships with their parents, their siblings, their friends, their loved ones. People use the word monster to describe those people all the time. So I think that second book being a little more intimate, the question there is like, is this woman a monster to those around her? And then, of course, there's the question of like, is it possible to hold any kind of power in the world without in some way becoming monstrous? just because your decisions affect so many people that by sheer scale, like, let's say you are running triage at an ER and you choose to treat this person instead of that, that's a necessary decision, but it is in some ways a monstrous one. And it's implicit in your job, just as being in government or in finance is going to involve decisions that touch so many lives.
So I just wanted to jump in once more really quickly before we totally move away from the short story, all of that thing, because I'm just so curious about this. I had no idea about that, and it just like opened a whole world of questions. I don't want to take up too much time on it, but was it written in tandem with the original manuscript, or was it like the short story first and you're like, oh, this could be a whole novel? Like, how did that develop?
The short story first, by several years. Okay. And then a couple of years later, I was like, I could try expanding this. I need something to write. I often think that short stories are the climaxes of novels. Part of the art of writing a good short story is cutting as much off the beginning as you can, starting the story as late as possible, as close to the crisis. That's not always true. Not every short story is like that. But in this particular case, it was easy for me to be like, here's the short story. It's this one event, but there's so much implied in what happened before. I would love to know. Almost a way to think of it is like, if the entire length of a novel is the act of, throwing a harpoon at the reader, and setting up, showing them all the forces that like choose the harpoon and throw it on this particular trajectory to hit this particular point in the reader's heart. The climax is the point where the pointy end of that harpoon goes through the flesh. But you can write just that point pierces heart moment, but the whole course of the harpoon is pretty interesting too. That's what a novel is.
Very cool. Thank you.
Earlier in the podcast, we had a discussion about the book too, and one question that came up for me was the title, because Chris had mentioned how, I forget which is which. It's just called Trader.
The Trader in the UK market and tour, and then the subsequent books obviously take out.
Yes.
So my question is that like an author, was that an override of your wishes from the publisher, or how did that happen?
That was a marketing decision to try to create broader appeal in the UK market. Like covers, it's one of those things that you can maybe provide a little input on, but ultimately that is up to the publisher. And Tor UK is I wouldn't say separate, but it's kind of a sibling organization to Tor in the United States. They have a slightly different chain of command, and they get to make their own decisions about what plays in their market. So different covers, different titles. It do be that way.
I was mainly just bemoaning the fact that the Trader Borrowed Cormorant is it has such character as a title that actually taking off the Borrowed Cormorant actually, I think, already kind of rips. I get why you would do it. Like it absolutely makes sense in terms of, because a bit like it was primarily described, the titles, especially when the spines are lined up, indicate a certain type of story. And I think even in a bookshop sense, when you're going in, you can kind of go, that has got my interest because of the progression even of the titles. But also on the other hand, it's like Borrowed Cormorant, it has its own language. It communicates that it has its own world immediately.
I've been surprised by how many people don't know what a cormorant is. Maybe that was part of the concern.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's interesting.
Just a theory, yeah. And you would expect the UK to be more familiar with cormorants than the US, having more coastline. Or more coastline proportional to its internal area.
Yeah. But I wanted to say too, I still have about 100 pages to go, but I've really enjoyed the word choices and name choices that you use in the book. I think it helps deepen the world, And yeah, I have questions, but I'll wait until I read the whole thing.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's great. It's a great book.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's been almost 10 years since I wrote it, which is enough time to get some distance. And one of the things I like the most about it is that it is also one of its weaknesses. It's a relatively skeletal book compared to the sequels. You know, you can just see looking at it on the shelves. It's 140,000 words, which is long for a novel, but short for a fantasy novel. And I think, you know, readers have a whole range of reactions to every book. And in this book, you know, negative reactions tend to be like, I didn't feel like I could get attached to the characters. I felt like things happened too fast. Or like the narrative was too brisk and detached and just telling you about motions of armies and economies and stuff. And I always think of that as like a design trade-off, you know. The price of doing this whole thing in 140,000 words as opposed to a trilogy is that there's a little bit of summary where there could have been scene. And in the later books, I did choose to do a lot more in scene rather than in summary. And the result is that they are a lot fatter and a lot slower. There are writers who are gifted at achieving both at once, who get a huge amount done that feels very rich and full fat in relatively little word count. I am not yet one of them. And I was certainly not when I was 23 writing this book. So, yeah.
That's great.
I have a question. I mean, I brought it up earlier, but now that you told me the games that you worked on, it's kind of been stewing over my mind. So I would say, in general, this book kind of eschews this idea that fantasy science fiction stories tend to be kind of low rent, if you know what I mean. They don't have big ideas, all of that kind of stuff. It's something from people who don't read the genre would say about it. And given that Destiny and Subnautica, one is a game that's very instance-based, right, which classically would be ascribed the same kind of thing insofar as, I don't get a good story from like RPGs, or it's very piecemeal, and then Subnautica, which is like an emergence kind of open world game. But both games are well known and famed for the storytelling, if you don't mind me saying, and how good a job that they do. Is it something that you kind of, there must be things that bleed from one into the other when you were doing one to the other?
Surprisingly little. I really don't cross the streams there. And, you know, I can't take a lot of credit for either of those games' narrative success. Destiny, you know, I can't talk too much about behind the scenes. They've drawn a lot on my lore for their stories, but the execution tends to be theirs. And Subnautica, I actually have not been with long enough for any of my work to be public. So I will say that writing for games is a huge challenge and very different from a book. And one of the hardest things is that you are so deeply attention limited. You're hoping that if you put a book or a short story in front of someone, they are just reading the words one after another, and that's pretty much all they're doing with their brain at the time. Maybe they're listening to music. With a game, you know, they're very much preoccupied with lots of other things. You could see this in playtests. You know, you'll have some dialogue play, and if it's not the sharpest, shortest, clearest thing you've ever written, they'll just be like, what was that? Because, you know, they're being eaten by a shark or whatever. They don't have time to listen to the radio. So the art of steering the player's attention to what you want them to see and hear is something that's not really present in novels. Yes, within the novel, you want readers to be excited and engaged, but you can pretty much take for granted that their eyes are pointed at the page, rather than at, you know, an oncoming train or whatever. Although if there were an oncoming train, I would hope they were paying attention to it and not the novel. I'm going to mute myself for 30 seconds to drink water.
Nice.
Yeah.
If no one else has a question, I mean, I will, while Seth is drinking, ask the question that one of the things that really struck me about the Trader Borrowed Cormorant, and it was actually something that initially took me a bit, like I had to adjust a bit, was I felt like the prose style itself was very distinct and unique. And I ended up falling in love with it. I mean, I thought it was wonderful, and I'm definitely someone who likes when authors have very clear voices, very unique voices. And so I was just curious if that was something that came about kind of naturally, that it was just sort of instinctually how you wrote, if there was a very distinct voice you were going for as you were writing, and how the prose of The Traitor Bar Cormorant, specifically book one, how that developed.
Yeah. Sorry, I missed the beginning of the question as I was watering myself, but I think I got it. How did the prose of the book develop?
Yes.
Short story writing requires a degree of precision and exactitude that can sometimes be pretty exhausting. Good short story writers can produce this like storyteller's voice where you don't really notice the effort they're putting in to make everything compact. Short story writers like me, I don't consider myself a great short story writer yet. Often I find when I cut my writing down for length, all that's left is the sharpest, spikiest, pointiest bits, the weirdest and most unique word choices, the strangest sentence structures, because the things you take out are kind of the fat, the connective tissue that's like just smooth and not really doing any work. So that's great for voice. You get this kind of concentrate form of your writing. But if I were to give you a can of like orange juice concentrate and tell you to drink it, I'm not convinced it would be that pleasant. And I think when you go from short story writing to a novel, you need a degree of slack in your words. You need to take it easier a little. You can't labor over every sentence the way you would in a short story. And you can't exhaust your reader the way you would in a short story. If every single sentence in your novel is like a crystal of beauty that they want to read 3 times, they're not gonna, be able to stick with it. I've had this experience reading novels that I really admire. Kat Valenti's Palimpsest is so rich, so ornately written, but I had to put it down every chapter because I felt physically full. I felt like I'd eaten a meal. So part of the goal with the Traitor Bar Cormorant's prose style was to make it a little more boring, by which I mean put a little more smooth sentences in there, sentences that are just doing 1 or 2 things. They're not too fancy. They're direct. I think of it a lot like a roller coaster. You need, hills to build up momentum before you do the twists and loops and stuff. So the balance between the sentences that give the reader energy, that are very direct, Baru threw a shoe at the wall. I'm just making this up. Versus something complex and descriptive with Baru like thinking about how the value of money is tied to the amount of it that's printed. You try to lay enough smooth sentence that when you hit a curvy, bouncy, spiky one, the reader has enough energy to just plow through it. If you look at a lot of really successful like YA books, they have a very clear, almost mechanical cycle of what notes they hit structurally, sentence by sentence. The Hunger Games is famous for this, of having a cycle of like Katniss perceiving some danger, a beat of like her reacting to it, and then maybe a moment of internality about how she feels about it. So the goal with this book's prose style was to capture a little bit of Baru's internal double consciousness and vision. She's kind of distanced from herself and from everything she's doing. The things she doesn't notice speak a lot, although I don't think readers explicitly notice this. But like, Baru doesn't notice families, she doesn't notice children. She's very focused on the things she's focused on and doesn't think at all about some kinds of beauty, about companionship, about warmth. And it leads to a prose style that's on purpose, quite sterile, like bone almost. You've scraped all the flesh off and there's only what's left required to keep the structure of Baru moving. And again, avoiding spoilers, but like the transition from the first to the second book, a lot of readers really didn't like it because my goal with the second book was to just, stop being so far away from her. I felt like that distance had collapsed inside her and she had to reckon with who she was, and the prose there is like septic and greasy and oily and like really caught up in her own feelings and her own depression and misery. I don't know. Does that count as a spoiler? Baru's miserable and depressed. Maybe you can bleep that out if you need to. But like the first book is such an effective piece of velocity, I think, with maybe a pacing slump in the third act. You know, it gets you from place to place pretty fast, and the prose reflects that. It's a vehicle. The voice dances between like a distant and close third, where normally you're pretty much in Baru's head, but occasionally you get bits of narration that are kind of summary of what she knows and what she's experiencing, rather than having it filtered through her own perception. Oh, this is all a lot to say, you know. It's a prose that's purposefully a bit sterile and clipped, but with, I hope, punctures of emotion.
That's I think what you just described there perfectly encapsulates, you know, how I read it, and was part of the what took adjusting is like I you know, went into it. I had some idea of where, like, what kind of the premise was and where the story was going, but I didn't really know about like the prose style and, you know, the distinct kind of tone, I guess, and it almost reminded me a bit of some sci-fi writing, you know, like what we might think of as more like quintessentially sci-fi. I think because of how cold it at times is, but there is that punctures of emotion that, you know, you don't really get in, say, like Asimov's writing, right? That I found really unique and distinct, and was the thing that I think stood out. To me, it epitomized Baru's character. I mean, I think that's why I left the book feeling like I really understood her as a character, and I felt like a lot of it came out through the prose. And so that you perfectly answered my question about that, because I do think the prose absolutely reflected who she was and what she was going through, and kind of how she was, you know, processing her pursuits, you know, without getting too detailed or spoilery.
Have you all seen Oppenheimer?
Yes.
I saw a couple no's, I think. Well, this is not a spoiler, but there's a technique Nolan uses in that movie, which I can't decide if I think is a gimmick or really cool, where, especially towards the end of the film, when when Oppenheimer is getting anxious, and especially when he's thinking about the atomic bomb and its consequences, the set behind him will rattle, as if it's being struck by wind. And it's such a weird, interesting, almost magical realist way of externalizing the character's conflict. And to me, the hope with Baru 1 was that the book would feel almost like a machine, because Baru is trying so hard to keep everything inside and on the rails, but, you know, there are points where the machine starts to rattle or snarl and the gears tear, and hopefully that comes through. But again, you know, I've gained a lot more appreciation over the years for the value of just saying things. You know, you try to be too fancy and cerebral with how you communicate everything, and it's like you're experiencing the story through frosted glass. There's not a lot of just saying stuff in that book, and I wouldn't change it, you know. But writing new things, you know, I've tried different prose styles that are a little less distanced.
I have a question about your choice of a female character as the main character. And I'm especially, you know, just impressed that you wrote this 10 years ago. I think, you know, it's ahead of its time in some ways, or was then. So what led you to that choice? And I'm also kind of curious why, or if you have any relation to the career that Baru was assigned to, in terms of financial, you know, dealings.
Absolutely not. I know nothing about accounting. I'm poor with my own personal finances. But I do have the relationship that many millennials do, which is the 2007 giant world economy crash, which to me, still to this day, I don't fully understand how an economy can crash. And I wanted to try to understand that. Because, you know, the same amount of people are there, they need the same things. There's the same amount of machinery to make the stuff. How can the economy stop working? It almost doesn't make first order sense to my brain. Like, demand is down. What does that mean? People don't want stuff anymore because they don't have enough money to buy it. Why don't they have enough money anymore? It's also, it's very, sorcerous. The idea that a few people in a few financial firms could make the wrong decisions with these bizarre financial derivatives no one understands, and thus destroy the world's economy and cause suffering for hundreds of thousands, millions of people. Like, what? That doesn't make any damn sense to me. And again, I'm not really smart enough to understand it, although I do have the pop culture grasp of it. But Baru's choice of profession was very much predicated on that. Like, do you really need wizards to cast curses on nations if we already have economists and economies doing it somehow? To the extent that the book has magic, it's that it has magic that... Sorry, it has economies that I can understand and have my characters manipulate. In real life, I don't really think that's true. Nobody really gets the economy. There are certain manipulations that, like, financial institutions and central banks and stuff do, but it's all whack. Even trying to describe basic terms like inflation, I don't think there's broad agreement on what inflation is or what causes it. And as for why she's a woman, like, it was a book inspired in large part by where the conversation about fantasy was then. And one thing you heard commonly, which people these days, I don't know, may not believe, but back then, all the time, in blog comments, in Facebook posts, was that the reason stories like this could not have female protagonists is that they would be too oppressed to do anything interesting. They basically had these assigned roles as mothers, wives, prostitutes. That's pretty much all the imagination at the time seemed to produce. This is not to erase the many, many, many incredibly talented women writers who were active back then and for decades before. It was just the state of the pop culture discourse. And you saw this going on with Game of Thrones, where, there'd be feminist pushback against gratuitous rape, and people would come back, oh, that's just realistic, that's how it was. And that outraged me, as someone interested in history, because even in these incredibly patriarchal, violent societies, women had roles that were not as simple as, like, you can't do anything, you just pop out babies. Women had complex, politically active involvement in government and economics and war. And I think if you end up creating a fantasy world that claims to be representing the truth of misogyny and oppression, but in fact is flatteningly misogynistic and oppressive, is more misogynistic and oppressive than history ever was, you're perpetuating a lie. You're showing your own ignorance. And so you'll note that, like, Baru is not a skilled fighter. She's not a Conan in most respects. She doesn't have any particularly great physical feats aside from being well-nourished and tall. And she's very much in compliance with her society's gender norms, too. And in Falcrest, one of the stereotypes about gender is that women are better at abstract thinking, which, even though it's a patriarchal society, what this ends up meaning is that women are used for lots of abstract labor, like mathematics, accounting, management, in service of men's profits. And so the power and authority she has still comes through her society. She's not an exception, even though there always were exceptions. But I did think, if you're going to look at the oppressive regime of an empire, you can't just take it for granted that they're misogynistic and racist. Misogyny and racism come in different forms and constructions in different places in history. There's no one universal form of it. So you have to come up with a reason and a way this empire is uniquely misogynistic. If you're going to look at misogyny, you need to look at the intersection with racism because, hatred of women hits women of different races differently. And then you've got to look at sexual orientation, because that intersects with it too. And even questions of ability, which, I didn't handle that well in the first book, but some of them are there. You end up with a point of, if you want to talk about one thing, you want to talk about everything. And that leads pretty naturally to a protagonist whose bearing up under all these forces. You know, every different axis of oppression is pointed at Baru and crushing down at her. And if you can make that a compelling protagonist, you know, it's kind of an argument that there's no such thing as being too oppressed to be interesting. You know, there are more oppressed people than Baru. She gets some lucky breaks. She's not like a prisoner or someone with a chronic illness, but she has it harder than most people. I hope that answered the question in some kind of interesting way.
Yes, it does. Thank you. Yeah, it does.
And,
There's a... Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I do think there's an easy reflex in all our heads that when we start talking about this stuff, we start imagining an issue book that's just about these things and didactic and wants to teach you a lesson. But for most people throughout most of history, they've had their lives and dealing with stuff like misogyny or, you know, it didn't have to be racism because racism in the modern sense is very much a post-colonial empires kind of invented it. But before that, you know, there were slaveries of different kinds, all kinds of ethnic and linguistic hierarchies in different parts of the world. Most people throughout most of history have had to deal with some kind of oppression. We have to believe that these people still have interesting stories. Clearly they do. You know, you have fascinating stories like a male slave becoming the second most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire, and then being strangled to death one day so that his lover, the Pasha, could marry a woman. These people have incredible stories, and the fact that they were experiencing some form of oppression didn't make those stories less interesting. It was just a fact of life for them, like having 4 limbs, or it rains some days, you know? You can still tell compelling stories that touch on this stuff. The constraints placed upon us are part of all our stories. Just as a story about, I don't know, the Japan in the shogunate period is going to touch on the obligations placed upon, say, a samurai or a Ada or whoever you write about. Just our relationships to other people and power structures are part of life. Articulating those clearly is part of telling anyone's story. It doesn't make it an issue book, just a book about reality.
A little bit earlier, we were discussing our favorite female characters. And do you have any characters that either are your favorites or that inspired your own characters?
Yes, so many that, you know, like being asked your favorite book, it's tough to... But off the top of my head, you know, Sabriel from Garth Nix's Porcelain books, I always thought was super well done. My brain is veering into male characters written by women for some reason. You know, Ursula Le Guin obviously has so many. Tehanu, this woman who, very frustratingly, I think, to the average fantasy reader, is given the opportunity, having been rescued from her life as a priestess, to become a wizard, to become a great sorcerer. And she turns it down and marries a farmer and, you know, kind of drops out of the story until the 4th Earthsea novel. But when you get back to her, she's so incredibly compelling, and you see so much of the worlds that the first 3 Earthsea novels had kind of neglected. God, you know, I'm racking my brain trying to find examples to make it clear that, you know, I read lots of different writers, and obviously that's not working. But
Well, I'll ask if you've read The Poppy War, because I do think it's really cool too that your strong, complex female character predates The Poppy War, which has another strong, complex female character. So
yeah, so I know Rebecca R.F. Wong. She did send me an advanced copy of that to Blurb, and unfortunately the PDF Harper Voyager sent me had an enormous Harper Voyager watermark, which was translated into the like size 72 words Harper Voyager in the middle of every page.
oh my god!
So I got about a third of the way through it and I was enjoying it, but I didn't finish it. Too many Harpers and too many Voyagers.
Oh my gosh!
God, I'm gonna forget the writer's name, but Petals of Blood by I can't pronounce this. It's a Kenyan novel by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I can't pronounce that. But one of the characters is a prostitute, the most stereotypical, otherized, exoticized role for, you know, a Kenyan woman to be cast in a novel read by Americans. Though the author, I'm sure, is Kenyan. But she's so... the author does not insist on her being a perfect person to the 20th or 21st century American reader. She's allowed to be vain and fickle and many other things, and is still an incredibly compelling character. I really liked that. There's... You know, an hour after this question, I'll think of hundreds of examples. You know how it is. It's the human brain. So I was trained in psychology, and the way we currently believe the human brain creates categories is not through yes/no rules or cladistics. The way that, say, you might try to define a human as a featherless biped or whatever, but through the system called prototyping, where your brain just takes every example of a category it's been fed and kind of averages them together into this big blob called a prototype. And so, for example, one way to test this is you can ask people, which is more bird-like, a sparrow or a penguin? And most people will probably agree that a sparrow is more of a bird than a penguin. Now, a penguin's kind of a weird outlier. And that's just because the sparrow is closer to the prototype of bird in your brain. If you lived in the Antarctic and only saw, you know, I don't know, skuas and penguins, you know, the penguin would probably be pretty birdy. The reason I say this is just that, you know, having read enough good fiction, you know, it's... I don't think of, like, 3 or 4 female characters I thought were great. That's just part of my idea of a character. They've all gone into that blender. Yeah, I mean, I was going to list things I've read recently and the great female characters in them, but I feel like I embarrass myself because I read so much trash. Anyway.
What have you been reading? I'm curious. What's going in the old brain? You know, mixing around up in there.
Skipping the academic stuff. I'm reading a book on the practice of spiritualism and shamanism in Mongolia after the collapse of communism, and it's good, but it's very academic. I just read Shogun by James Clavell, which is like at the foundation of this strain of American Orientalism. Like, I grew up reading licensed novels, BattleTech, and I'm like, oh, all the Japanese characters in these books were written by white writers who read Shogun and loved it. And, you know, I can right now, I'm sure, Google the book and find 100 takedowns of its historical errors and moral failings, but it was an incredibly compelling story. I really liked it. And, you know, it had these characters, these women who had very prescribed social circumstances, and who in fact exist in a power structure so precarious where you routinely would just, according to this book, I don't know how historically realistic it is, would be ordered to kill yourself just over slight flaws in etiquette or whatever. And what I really enjoyed about the book was it starts out seeming like it's condemning these people, and by the end you fully understand how someone could live in this society and see it as good, which is in no way to be like, yes, the caste system in feudal Japan was great and I morally endorse it. It's just, it was a compelling story. Compelling stories are built from all kinds of horrible things. What else? I read a book on animal perception recently that was really good. It just gets into all these, tries to solve, you know, like how various non-human animals see the world and experience it, and how blinkered we are. You know, human senses are quite remarkable in many respects, but we have a tough time thinking about how something with different senses would work. That was really valuable for me in thinking about how to write Aliens, about the things we take for granted that every organism would have that might not be present. So, really simple example. There was a postulate in this book, it hasn't been proven, that squid, cannot tell where they're wounded. They can tell they're wounded, and they will move away from whatever has wounded them. But shrimp are eaten so often, damaged so often, that they've never really evolved a reason to figure out what particular part of their body has been injured. Just have this full body sense of like, oh, something's wrong, I gotta leave. You can test this by generally the way this is tested is by seeing if animals favor or groom a particular place that's been wounded, and squid don't seem to do so. So the idea of, you know, an alien that does not have a particularly physicalized sense of pain, but it's more just like a fever. I don't know. Interesting thing. There's a lot of fish that behave like modems. Weird shit like that.
So do you read a lot of nonfiction these days?
Yes, when I think it's going to be, you know, helpful for writing.
For sure.
Yep.
Tied into that, sorry, just like continuing this train of thought, what were the books, you know, what were the inspirations for the Trade of Bardo Cormant and the Masquerade in general?
So the very first thing, I think this qualifies as a spoiler. I'll skip that.
Is it premise based, or because I feel like we've talked a little bit about sort of the premise, but I don't know if it's based on the big kind of happenings in the back end of the book, or, you know, because that, which I can imagine being an early seed.
Yeah. I mean, I'm having written the ending first, definitely.
Okay,
but
right, yeah.
I take I'm kind of a contrarian. I like disagreeing with people. I don't think much of world building for the sake of world building. The first thing that came to me about this book was the character and the unique place she ends up at the end of the book. You know, what's going on in her head, and everything else about the story comes from there. That's like the ice crystal that aligns everything else in the lake. All the details of the setting, the other characters, just orbit around this flaw, this crack in Baru. But, you know, can't talk about that more without spoilers. Other stuff, you know, I read a lot about... History is really interesting to research I'm not a historian. From a pop culture perspective, usually my process is, you know, vaguely something, the lay account of some piece of history, like the Islamic Golden Age. And you go and you research it and you immediately find some kind of high energy debunking. So I'm trying to think of good examples of this. Again, I wish I could think of examples of things easily. But, you know, thing wasn't actually like A, it was actually like B. And then, usually, if you keep poking around, you will find that the contrarian take itself is disputed by some very devoted scholars who've written lengthy, difficult to parse papers about how the reality was neither A nor B, but some weird C. And so I usually do enough research to try to get to that C. You know, okay, I'm sorry, this is a stupid example, but pop history of World War II. You know, I would say the lay story is America defeated the Nazis. The reaction story is really Soviet Russia defeated the Nazis. And then if you dig into it even more, there's this complex story about Lend-Lease and global systems and why so many Russians had to die, and it's hard to boil down to a single pat thing. But I'm always trying to do that, like that third step of research where you break through the first assumptions and then the second layer of like clickbait debunking and get to the really meaty stuff. That was inspiration for a lot of the Baru setting. You know what else was a huge inspiration? A card game called Dominion.
Oh, I love Dominion.
It's a super simple card game about making a medieval domain, I guess. And you can choose lots of different ways to do it. It's very colorful. It plays in about 20 minutes with friends, or you can play it against a computer. And it's just so satisfying to slap those cards down. I wanted to have this setting to have the same satisfying sense of commerce and presence where, like, in an almost color-coded way, you know, salt comes from over here, and this is why we need salt. Cattle come from here. You know, kind of like Settlers of Catan with the hexes, which, you know, Settlers of Catan, we could get at all the colonial subtext there, but there is a sense to which Arduin, the setting, is laid out like a board game map with a degree of legibility. You know, you're trying to get the reader to be like, hey, I see this map, I see what resources are located here, I see how conflicts could arise over it. There's something very satisfying about understanding the logic of a place and being like, ah, yes, there's going to be political strife here, there's going to be war here. It's not realism, because reality is always more gross and complicated and messy, but it's a kind of colorful, systems-y tractability, where you feel like, here's a cool little diorama with some painted figures. I could move them around and intuit what happens. Because, this is a story of high finance and manipulation and war. You want readers to understand, how the machine is turning before Burroughs starts breaking it and modifying it. And that's something readers have really missed, I think, in the sequels. They want that colorful, tangible, Baru turns knobs and things happen feel. And it's something I'd like to get back to for the fourth book, but I did want to spend some time, debunking the idea that the world can be cleanly manipulated like a board game.
Stepping back to what you were talking about, about investigating and doing your dives of history and actually linking that to something like James Clavell's Shogun. I think this is often how modern people discover history, because we get these broad swathes in class and when we're growing up, but often popular culture gives us an interesting story or construct that we find interesting, and then wikis get found out, and the wiki then takes you down into actually the detail of what happened. And I think a lot of our discovery of truths and revisiting truths, a bit like you were saying, has evolved over the last few years with the advent of availability of information on the internet, etc., and then scholarly papers, to kind of question a lot of the accepted truths that we were told about, say, conflict or otherwise.
Yeah. No, it's fantastic. Here I thought of a good example. Sexual hospitality. This idea that when you rolled up to certain islands in the Pacific and Polynesia, they'd be like, here's my daughter, take her to bed. It is not clear that this practice ever actually existed. And there are many reasons it's unclear that it ever actually existed. One may have been women on a certain island might have been like, hey, I want some trade goods. You want to have sex with me for trade goods? And, traders or whatever viewed this as a, some formalized thing where a man was telling them to do it. Another may be just that missionaries wanted to exotify and scandalize these people and made shit up. I don't have the work in front of me, but it's not really important what the actual truth was. The important part is just that you don't take the idea of sexual hospitality as a given, something that definitely happened, that you do a little footwork and try to find the complexity. But yeah, I mean, there's so many resources for finding right and wrong things about history, and things we don't know are right or things we don't know are wrong. And I feel that should have the effect of opening our phase space of possibility up. It should lead us to treat history as a place where more things could have happened than we expected, and different things than what we've been taught to accept in a pat, easy way. Paromita, I feel like we've completely blanked you for a while. If you're there.
Oh, did we lose Paromita?
I'm muted, but yes, I'm here and I'm thinking along with you.
Okay.
Well,
Yes.
Paromita, are you there?
Yeah. Can
Yes,
I ask
I'm
you
here.
a possibly rude question?
Sure.
Are you Indian? I'm just guessing from your accent and name. Whereabouts?
Yes, I am from India. Yes.
Okay.
I'm
Cool.
from West Bengal.
I ask because the British Raj and before that the whole kind of desecration of the Indian Ocean trade network by the Portuguese and by the British was a huge inspiration for the Baru novels, and the bizarre relationship between the British and the people they colonized. At one point, the East India Company's presence in India was governed by 40 people in a drab office building in England. And this also touches on Guns, Germs, and Steel. But the question of how do 40, quite young Englishmen end up ruling over the subcontinent of India, this incredibly powerful, dynamic civilization. It's so bizarre. It beggars belief. And one of the first things Baru asks her mother, in this book, just as Jared Diamond's friend asks him at the beginning of Guns, Germs, and Steel, is why are these people coming here and colonizing us? Why is it not happening some other way? Why aren't we going to them? That's a question Baru's really interested in. Certainly a question Guns, Germs, and Steel is interested in, even if I think no one really agrees with the answer it gives anymore. I've been listening to a podcast called Empire by Anita Anand and some guy, which is pop history of various empires. And the first one they go through is the British Raj and the East India Company occupation before that. And it is such a stunning chain of weird coincidences. Things like one army getting rained on before a battle, just luckily, so the British could win the battle because their powder was dry. You just could never write this shit. No one would believe it. Yet at the same time, these instances, these coincidences are happening at the cutting edge of this kind of structure of historical forces. Like, there are big, semi-deterministic things happening to make the British want to colonize India and bring them here at this point. And that interaction between, like, the macro level seeming determinism and the micro level chaos and contingency is really compelling to me. It's easy to make history boring if it's all about, like, changing patterns of land use or, the iron law of oligarchy or whatever. But the fact that these weird things still happen on the ground is so interesting and makes the romance and the drama. Also, just the fact that so much of this interaction between cultures, which is now seen as determined, was not in any way. Like, there was a period of time early in the British-Indian interaction where British people in India routinely took Indian spouses and acculturated to Indian culture. And it was not until this very sharp intervention by Christian and government interests in Britain that was changed, and this ideology of we are here to civilize this place and make it British really took over. It could have gone some other way, but I don't think we remember that. I don't think we treat this colonialism thing as inevitable rather than as, in many ways, a moral decision. It's not inevitable that Britain would go occupy India and pillage it and massacre people. People made decisions that led to that. They are morally culpable. You never want to lose sight of that talking about colonialism. Yeah, because people are always like, well, people have always this comes up in the books. People have always conquered other people. There have always been empires. Yeah, that's true. There have also always been different interactions, better interactions, I would say, morally. The fact that something happens a lot doesn't make it right, and it always happens a different way depending on where and when. Good podcast.
Yeah. And I like your idea, I sort of think of the butterfly effect, like one or two people make a decision and next thing you know, it's like this rolling boulder that's become just something else entirely, that's running over people. And I kind of enjoy that in fiction. I think it is because it reminds me of reality too,
Yeah.
Just like you've been saying, the 2007, 2008, was it really, did it really all boil down to, what, a few scores of people making the wrong decisions and promoting the wrong policies, so it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, or look at the Belgian Congo. If King Leopold hadn't wanted a vanity colony, millions of people would have had very different, much better lives. To this day, the consequences of that atrocity are still ongoing. All just because this one man, he wanted a colony.
Right. And it's still happening today, really, Yeah. But I think that's what makes fiction so interesting to me. I think it is a way of working out realities, like when you read, like right now, reading about Baru, and just it gives me, the reader, a way of placing myself in her shoes, and then also just sort of working out all the issues that are surrounding her and the other characters, So, but yeah, so that's something I take from fiction I really enjoy.
Paromita, you still there?
Yes, I am still here. I was wondering whether, I mean, it's not a spoiler, but it is, it's not a plot spoiler, but it is about an emotion that the book generated. I've been trying to think of a way to phrase this, but I'm not being very
Yes.
successful. Should I give it a try anyway? Uh, okay, thank you. One of the things when I was reading Traitor especially, but I think also Monster and Tyrant is how many times can a person be cleaved in half and be fragmented before they completely shatter
Yeah,
to pieces?
I mean, that's a great question. Especially for people who, are raised with multiple identities or are used to hiding part of themselves, whether it's a religious belief or they're gay or queer or, I think a lot of readers who are diasporic, they've been raised between cultures. I've seen something in Baru where that there was a great essay written by, I think, an Indian guy about how Baru made him feel having gone to an English school and having a very disdainful relationship with his own Indian culture. But regarding the question of being cut in half, Baru's mental health is quite difficult. You've kind of asked a very profound question about human identity, which is there any part of us that actually endures? Is there any kernel in us that has to stay the same for us to stay us? Or are we just what happens to us, All right, to borrow a popular historical example, Phineas Gage, railroad worker, he gets a railroad spike blasted through his head. This is a common Psych 101 example of, altering the brain changes your personality. And he famously became cranky, he swore all the time, couldn't work. But the part of the story nobody tells is that he then made a near complete recovery and went on to hold down a job as, I think, a coach driver, which is pretty mentally demanding. You have schedules, you got to manage your horses. Now, he did end up dying of seizures, so I guess this recovery wasn't complete, but this horrible, physically traumatic thing happened to his brain, and yet he wasn't erased as a person. He became someone else. I think we are tremendously resilient. And while I would never say that difficult things happening to us only end up making us stronger, you can absolutely take permanent, irrecoverable damage, lose years of your life to things like trauma, depression, grief. I don't think you can destroy a person by dividing them that way. I think you can compromise them. I think you can hurt them very badly. But short of, a condition like Alzheimer's or serious damage to your identity, I think our brain is a tremendously powerful engine for accepting things that happen to us and turning them into more of us. We don't always like the person we become. But far, I think, more frightening to me than the idea of Baru, far more frightening to Baru than the idea of being divided and subdivided until she's no longer sure who she is the possibility that her actions will not come out the way she wants. I think she, maybe foolishly, is far less concerned with the mutilation of her own identity than with losing the ability to distinguish what she thinks of as right from what she thinks of as wrong. There are lots and lots of lines she's willing to cross and bargains she's willing to make, but there are certain things she is not. This is a spoiler, but throughout the series, she never considers having sex with a man. She considers having a child through, whatever process, but her own bodily autonomy is really important to her and that of other women. I think Baru characterizes herself more by the effects she ends up having on the world and the people around her than by the mess inside her head. I mean, my head's a mess. I don't know if I could easily characterize myself from what's going on in there, but I hope, in some ways the purest point of contact I'm going to have with the most people is this book, not whatever's going on in my skull. Most of the things in my skull will die with me. But tens of thousands of people have read this book. In some way, it's the most real thing I've ever done. So yeah, really interesting question. Not sure I answered it. Not sure it can be answered because it's kind of about, how do you define human identity? I also think there are many... Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, this is...
I was going to bring up partition and the wounds of partition in India, but I'm not well educated enough to say anything, super elaborate about it. I guess what I will say is that colonialism in particular takes very complex existing cultural and political landscapes and just draws lines on them. This is something Seeing Like a State, one of my favorite books, really gets into the need of the colonizer to simplify and make legible. And in the case of Britain partitioning India and Pakistan, they drew a line. And as a result, I cannot begin to tally how many people suffered. This is not to, I don't know shit about it. I can't tell you whether partition was good or bad. But I do know it was done very poorly and very wrongly, just as Sykes-Picot and so many other colonial parcelings up of real human existence have been done. There's a kind of division that leaves wounds, that fucks things up for a long time.
Very true.
Yeah. Go ahead.
You have spoken to somebody who is third generation of somebody who had to flee what is now Bangladesh and come to West Bengal as a result of partition. So I'm the third generation. My maternal grandmother and her entire family, paternal grandfather and his entire family, all had to come over.
Nothing intelligent I can say to that. Your experience is in many ways more real than anything I could put in this book. So again, I'm revealing how shallow my knowledge of so many things is, but this process of coming back to yourself and realizing that what was taken from you has value, it makes me think about Gandhi and how Gandhi, the icon of so many things, good or bad, depending on who you ask, was a huge British nationalist at first. When he was in South Africa, he was all for the British system. When World War I rolled around, he was like, we should go fight for the British. And it was not until promises made to India were betrayed that he was like, hang on a minute. These British people. I mean, anyone can correct me if I'm getting the history wrong, but part of what fascinates me about colonialism as a specific form of imperialism and control is it gets in your head. And it can convince someone very intelligent like Gandhi, that the people who rule him have his best interests in mind, when in fact they're a bunch of greedy, ignorant, squabbling, petty politicians. We think of, I think the received pop culture version of Gandhi is an upstanding moral agent. And if someone like that could have spent so much of his life believing the lies fed to him, there's something interesting going on there, something worth writing about. I am not the person, of course, I'm not a colonized subject. I by no means should have the only voice on this, but if you're going to write about the interactions of empires, it seems like something worth bringing up.
Good to know the world's changed.
Sorry, what was that?
It's good to know the world's changed. Those ideals that you're talking about, the watching of the corruption of the system. We've evolved so much as a society from those times, because it's still very realistic and prevalent.
Yes, it is. Not to spoil all my writing ever, but to me, the fundamental question of human existence in our effort to organize good civilizations is, assume we're all going to come up with different competing systems of morality to organize our tribes, our societies, whatever. And in some way, these systems are going to compete with each other for resources and people. Is it ever possible for one of these systems to hold on to what's good and generous and compassionate about itself when put in competition not only with others, but with those who seek to exploit it from within. Like, look at your body, wonderful thing. All these different cells cooperating. But almost every single one of those cells has a bomb in it. If that cell becomes too selfish, starts replicating on its own, one of those P53 genes is going to trigger it to suicide. And if we didn't have those, our bodies would not work. It's this incredible... The human organism is this incredible bit of collaboration and mutual aid. This triumph of working together instead of competing. But there is this incredibly potent cellular morality there backing it up. This iron fist of like, if you don't work for the body, we will kill you. We have to kill you for it to work. Does every human society need to have a anti-corruption measure that intense? Like, how do you protect anything good from being taken over by those who would use it to advance themselves? Because you got to figure, if one actor is using the system 100% to advance themselves, and the other actor is spending 80% of their energy on advancing themselves and 20% on actually doing good things, the one who's 100% corrupt is going to win. Unless there's some kind of rule, some kind of law. What is that law? How do we make it? How do we come up with it? It's a pretty interesting question to me.
Well, yeah, I mean, going off of that, like, how do you stop, the anti-corruption body from becoming corrupted itself, and then driving things in its own way? You think about whether it be something like law enforcement or anything that's supposed to be on the side of, like, law and justice and insert any sort of ideal here. Like, that is sort of the eternal dilemma, right? Is like, how do we create a system that survives human, flaws and our own sort of tendency towards self-destruction. At the same time, we're so good at creating things. It's these eternal contradictions that I think define the human experience. And similarly, is something that I, as a writer, also find very interesting. It's kind of the notions of humanity neither is like inherently good or inherently bad, but as like the complex interplay between it and ourselves, and particularly the systems we create, and like how that then manifests with the individual.
And you can see it. Sorry.
Oh, no. I'm pretty much done saying what I was saying. Yeah.
In the book, there are, just as in reality, there are many people who say the Masquerade, the Empire of Masks, is, on net a good thing. Is it worth, destroying or changing, given the alternatives, given the chaos and suffering that so often comes with regime change historically or in the present day? And I personally am very morally against that opinion, but I think it makes for good drama to have people representing it. And in some ways, I have made the Masquerade, the Empire Baru works for and struggles with, a little too successful. They're pretty smart, and historically a lot of empires have been very stupid and clumsy, and have just done very foolish things, or very evil things, just because they could. But, as a rhetorical construct, as something made up by people, the Masquerade is the obligation to make more sense than reality, which is under no such constraints to readers' suspension of disbelief. Regarding what you were saying about, how to order good societies, I will now actually advocate a YouTube video called The Rules for Rulers, which I think is a very good summary of the problems of ruling and having a power structure. And one thing I think this video gets into is, why are nations with the resource curse, it's called, why are nations with a single source of wealth so often corrupt and unstable? Like, say, oil. And the answer is basically that if there is a single point of control over the resources and the keys to power, it's a very unstable system. It's like you only need to control that thing and you control access to power. Whereas in a system like a republic, hopefully a functioning republic, access to power requires the support of many different people, hopefully even a majority of the population. You don't need the support of the populace to rule a petrostate. You just need the support of whoever's buying your oil abroad and whoever's producing it domestically. Dune gets into this a little, I guess, so not really. So how to organize systems so they don't have those single points of failure is, an interesting question. I'm curious how many of the solutions for, say, a biological organism like a body also apply to a political organism. Did you know that rabies is so deadly because it infects nerve cells, and when the immune system comes to destroy the infected cells, the nerves literally have a privilege they can flash that says, hey, I'm a neuron, don't kill me. It would be really bad if the immune system started destroying all our nerves. So this lets the rabies get through because...
Interesting.
That is interesting.
So do you guys have any... Yeah. No.
Sorry, go ahead. No, please go ahead. I do have a question, but
This is the right time. I was about to pitch to a different topic.
Oh, okay. I wanted to share, part of it is just my musings as a reader. And one of the things that really spoke to me in the book on a very individual level is the denial of catharsis. So it's this feeling which is amplified for me, which you said in the beginning of the second book, there was a slight tonal shift, but it's like, somebody who is in such deep anguish and it's like, oh, but there is no voice to that pain. It is just all inside and it is festering and some of it is putrefying, but there is no outlet. And it was it moved me deeply. But my question is sort of related to this. In the beginning of the Traitor Baru Cormorant, either in the beginning or in your afterword, you say that I know where Baru is going. I need to get her there. Readers, you have patience. We just need to get her there. And then I think Tyrant Baru Cormorant, which was published around 2020, sometime in 2020, you say that these books are quite difficult to write. And the end for Baru is in sight, but please have patience. And in between that 2020 and now we are in 2023, something happened to all of us. We were all facing something which I think caused tremendous upheaval in all our lives. So I was wondering today, do you have something to say to your readers, both current and prospective?
About when the fourth book is going to come out?
No, about how things are hard and sometimes things don't turn out. That afterwards spoke to me so much. So I just wondered if you have something to say today to your readers.
Wow. I've been pretty open with the fact that, my ability to work on this series has been, it strongly interacts with kind of my brain weather, whatever's going on up there. After the first book, I worked at a software company and we went through an extended period of crunch, which is like working 100 hours a week. And, I left that company because I was suicidal. I couldn't work anymore. And I was very, very badly depressed for years afterwards. Didn't do any writing. I did a lot of writing. I threw it all out. Getting through that was in large part down to getting professional help, getting meds, which changed my body, changed my relationship with people around me, but, on net helped. I can't say that, I had any particular strength or resilience that got me through it. There were people around me who were willing to help me. But you could never... There is a tremendous value to overcommitted, irrational hope and perseverance. And the reason for that is that it is so easy, and I know this because of, the depressive episodes I've talked about, for the instruments you use to measure your own worth and your own happiness to go wrong, to skew. One thing I remember a lot from depression was perseveration, which is just spiraling through the same thoughts over and over and over. And the most insidious thing about that, the dwelling on things that have been done to you that you think are wrong, is that it feels very normal. You assume everyone else's head works the same way. Similar example, content warning for anyone who wants to mute this, talking about self-harm and stuff, but like, for me, a canary when I'm having a depressive episode is if I see a car passing or a knife, I will think about the way I could use that to end my life. And when I was depressed for many years, I assumed naturally everyone had these thoughts because, you know, it's famous, the imp of the perverse. You walk up to a cliff, part of you is like, jump off, jump off. But, you know, having gone on medicine, having been much happier, I've realized that actually these thoughts never occur to me in my day-to-day life. And that when they do, I know something's wrong. So I don't know if this in any way answers your question, but what I would say to people facing tremendous uncertainty and hardship is that not only is it true that you've got to put your own oxygen mask on first, that you've got to tend to yourself, but in order to be an effective helper or a friend or family member, your own head has to be in a place where it can generate useful, good, adaptive behavior. It is not selfish or wrong to look at your own mental machinery and think, I need to tune this up. I need to rest. I need to care for it. You know, I'm absolutely the kind of person who used to really binge work on projects, do a ton of stuff. That was great. It was super productive. I still can write large amounts when I'm in that focus mode. But if you push yourself too hard, if you're too, not cruel, but too callous to yourself, you will lose things that will not come back, that will not grow back. You'll find other ways to do them. But, you know, like right now, my concentration is totally shot. I think probably as a result of getting a smartphone. But like, I'm seriously having to look at what do I do to myself to repair my ability to concentrate? Is it just getting more internet blockers? Do I need to be on some kind of drug? All this to say, in times of great uncertainty and peril, which, you know, unfortunately I think will continue to happen, you have a responsibility, a moral responsibility to take care of yourself so that you can take care of others. And especially if you're online, which I really think you shouldn't be, but if you're on social media and you are constantly seeing people talk about everything that is wrong, the truth is you can do little to nothing about any of it. And it is not actually your moral duty to be aware of all of it constantly so that you can feel terrible and sad about it. Consciousness raising is great, but it is not your obligation to be miserable for everyone else's pain at all times. Nothing can take away your right to have a little happiness and a little meaning in your own life. I don't know. Did that answer the question at all? Was that the kind of thing you were hoping to hear? I don't know. I just made all that shit up.
No, it's very well said.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Just thank you. And Baru spoke to me very, very viscerally.
I'm glad.
Just thank you.
You know, something Baru struggles with, her particular weird version of this, is she has done so many terrible things. She feels that she cannot in any way rest or be kind to herself because it would be betraying the people she has betrayed in the name of a greater good. The only way she can justify to herself the things she has done is that it allowed her in the long run to achieve some greater goal that was worth all this. So she has a tough time being kind to herself. And one might argue she doesn't deserve to be kind to herself. You're completely free to read these books with her as just a villain, not a good person. That's your prerogative as a reader. Anyway.
Yeah.
I was going to ask if... Yeah, Steve, go.
No, I'll just quickly mention that I've seen... It seemed to have noticed a lot of people lately searching out what they call digital minimalism and trying to get away from their smartphones and get away from social media. So I think it seems like it's a growing trend of people trying to get away and trying to go back to keep it a journal, like a written journal, or just avoiding those kind of things. So it's interesting to see how we're craving those things again, or it seems like we're coming around in a circle, and so it's encouraging to see people trying to unplug and just kind of take a walk, or find other methods of keeping their notes or their schedule or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I don't think people have seriously thought about how fucked up it is to record everything you say in a permanent record visible to everyone in the world. You know, it's not a bad thing that we as humans tune ourselves to our audience. You know that some people are more comfortable with some parts of us than others. I would say things to my partner. She's used to me being a complete goofball in ways that I would not behave on this podcast. It is depriving us of something fundamental to human communication to ask us to microblog or whatever in a permanent, eternally legible form all our most inane thoughts, to create this authoritative record of our identity that people can 5 years later go back to and scroll through and be like, well, you thought this, that's pretty problematic. We as humans, we're not designed to withstand that kind of scrutiny. I'm sure if somebody had recordings of everything I said all the time, they would be able to find some shit that would make me sound like a monster. Nothing that bad. I'm hoping, but a little creative editing.
I also think there's a process that you go through. Let's say I'm a bit older than some here, where you realize how much energy it actually takes to engage in social media at all. Like, even passively reading it is energy sapping in some ways, and I've found, like, as time has passed, I just have less space in my life for even wanting to engage. I can do it at a passive or a distance kind of sense, but actually, in terms of tweeting on a regular basis, I maybe had 10,000 tweets in the first 2 years, and maybe 150 since.
Yeah, well, especially because you're submitting your behavior for evaluation by an algorithm that wants to feed you ads. Part of the reason social media sucks is that it is optimizing for engagement, and people engage when they are angry and hurt. So you have a machine designed to show people the things that anger and hurt them as often and as intensely as possible to get ad money. It's not even profitable. It's not even a good machine. It's just very compelling.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask if you guys have any favorite writers you wanted to name drop. We have not had a favorite writer conversation so far, so I feel like I'm letting down the team.
God.
I know.
That's the hardest question, isn't it? Yeah.
Have you read or interviewed anyone recently that hopefully you enjoyed everyone, but tell me who you've been doing?
We've been reading, a few of us have been reading the Manifest Delusion series by Michael R. Fletcher. We've been reading that. We were reading, we're always up to something. We have a club on our forum. It's a small little community, but our friend Varsha has a series, FF Masterworks, we've been reading books. Yeah. We've been reading Lords of Light and Shadow by Johnny Wirtz, which has been spectacular. Johnny's fantastic.
Childhood standbys. It's really cool to see her still around. So many women, especially, just get paved over and forgotten. Try to find a Julian May fan these days, even though she was publishing at the same time as George R. R. Martin. It's cool to see someone who was on my shelf as a kid still chugging along. Still getting more attention. It feels like.
I'm working as hard as anybody and engaging readers with her work and all that kind of stuff. Like Johnny's sort of an inspiration to many of us now that we've got to know her a bit and stuff. We had to our other, one of my personal favourites, Christopher G. Brennan, we had on a Friday conversation a few weeks ago. I have an awful lot of time for Christopher and his Hellborn King saga, and I'm a super fan probably for that,
You ever read Yunha Lee?
No.
It's on my list.
Nine Fox Gambit, yeah. He's a friend of mine.
Yeah.
Ever read C.J. Cherry?
Somebody had recommended her book, those books, a while ago. It may have been...
That was Johnny,
It
right?
might have been Johnny, or it might have been Mahir. It was definitely one of the two of them. Her one, two from...
Her first novel was fantasy. I think Fortress in the Eye of Time. Is that? And she is I think her Morgaine books are her most popular fantasy books. Anyway, I mostly read her science fiction, but she's such a casually ambitious writer. You pick one of her books up, and even if it's not huge, some of them are, you're like, damn, this is a novel. And diversity has become such a conversation over the past 10 years that we forget that these people were around before we started making a point of talking about them. Like Cherry's married to a woman. She was writing with a male pseudonym since the 70s or 80s, getting acclaim. Like, she's an absolute heavyweight. I really recommend her. And if you don't like one of her books, she's got hundreds more.
I've been enjoying Emily St. John Mandel quite recently as well. She has a humanistic way of writing characters within these dystopian kind of worlds that I just find utterly compelling. I just can't quite put my finger on it, other than they're kind of loosely dystopian worlds, but it's really character work is what she's doing.
The Devourers by Indra Pramit Das is a werewolf novel set in... they're not exactly werewolves. Set in India, I'm not sure exactly when. Really liked it. Came out a few years ago, but I always recommend it. It's alongside like The Library at Mount Char on my list of books that are like kind of sui generis. They're just one of a kind, not really anything else like them. I guess there are more werewolf books.
I like The Library at Mount Char so much, but I don't think Scott Hawkins has published anything after that. So I'm eagerly waiting when
I
he
think
come
it's
up with something again.
something that is not often talked about is that being a writer can suck. It can suck more after you've been published. It can be deeply frustrating and corrosive to the self, especially if you're not. There are so many ways it can suck, and I don't know Scott's situation, but when someone writes something so brilliant and then disappears, there are so many ways to make the process awful for yourself. Not saying that Scott has like made the process awful for himself. For all I know, he's off designing microchips or something. But I always think of people like that, and I'm curious about how they are. Sometimes I write to them,
I speaking to that, I think one of the things that's really hard is if you get caught up, any number of comparisons, right? I mean, certainly sales is one thing. You can get caught up in reviews, you can get caught up in just like writing speed, and that's something that I always find so it's difficult for me to sort of process. Is like I think I'm a bit slower than I would like to be, and it's and I'm very much like you, Seth. You talk about like how these books are impacted by your like mental state and things like that, and like that's definitely I mean, since publishing my first one, which was literally only a few months ago, writing has been a lot harder. And I have a career in the entertainment industry. We're on strike right now, and so that's added to things, and like it's hard not to take it personally, like take your own lack of drive personally, where it's like 1,000 things are going on, and you may find any number of like excuses, to beat yourself up about like ways you're failing, as a writer or whatever, that it can make things hard, and certainly isn't, I don't know that's as widely discussed.
Yeah, two of the most important pieces of advice for writers, I think. First, you remember riding in a car on the highway when you were a kid and you'd be going slightly faster than the car next to you and it would look like it was moving backwards? Maybe this makes no sense. Anyway, my point is that if your ability to criticize your own work is growing faster than your ability to do good work, it will feel like you are getting worse. It's a very powerful optical illusion. I think, especially for new writers who really just decided to take it seriously, their ability to find out what's wrong with their own work is going to grow so much faster than their ability to fix it, that there's a ravine you've got to get across. And the other thing is just that, another car analogy, even though I don't drive, if pressing the right pedal is not making the engine produce words, the answer is not to press the pedal harder. If the engine's broken, it doesn't matter how much gas you give it, it's not going to turn.
Right.
So like just being like, I must sit at this computer and focus. All right, granted, it could be a focus problem. You might need to turn on an internet blocker, but if you just feel miserable sitting at that page, you need to not be miserable before you can write. Maybe for some people, just pushing through it works. It doesn't for me.
I think that's a really potent lesson. Certainly has been one in the last few months I've been grappling with for the first time in my life where writing has come difficultly. I've been writing for over a decade. Much more casually when I was younger, but still consistently. And it's been like I'm having to relearn things, relearn like how to write, like in the most like literal sense of like sitting yourself down and like getting yourself in the right mind state to like, even when it's difficult, pump out some words. And it's a strange thing.
I think if you take the craft seriously, that will keep happening forever. Like it's constantly going to feel like you're, at least for me.
Right.
Maybe I'm just not good at writing. I don't know. I was going to say something really clever and insightful about... Oh, no, it wasn't clever and insightful. It was self-aggrandizing and obnoxious. For me, the problem has been that I'm very good at writing a ton of words. This sounds like a humble brag. It's not. It's actually really horrible. I write long-ass drafts really fast, and
oh wow,
nothing is as useless as a 250,000 word bucket of ground beef. That's not a meal. I have produced this great number of words, but it has no shape, it has no structure. Anyone who read it would probably be bored. I really have to figure out, how to go back to that short story wisdom of where to stop the scene, how to stop the damn thing from just growing and getting so long. Between my first and second book, when I was really struggling with drafts for that, I did more than 1 million words of drafts on my second book. It's just, it's an awful lot. It's about 8 to 10 books of stuff to delete, but like, it sounds impressive. It's not. It was just rewriting the same mess. The smarter thing to do would have been to step further back and figure out what was like, blocking is the wrong word. What was causing this diarrhea, this logorrhea, this shapelessness? I think if I'd invested in some skills there with structure and stuff in a really rigorous way, it would have paid off later.
It's a lot of words.
Yeah, by the way,
that is a lot.
If you want to know a great structure to stick to avoid things like that, my first book, The Trader Borrowed Cormorant, before I did anything, I just sat down in Scrivener, made 3 folders for acts, split them each into 10 chapters, split each chapter into 4 scenes, and that's a great structure. You do 30,000 words an act, or 40,000, even 90 to 120,000 word novel, nice and tight. The 9th chapter of every act has to be the climax. The 10th is the consequences and fallout that set up the problem of the next act. Each chapter is a scene of setup, a scene of complication, a climax. 4th scene sets up the next chapter. Just hit those beats, you're great. I did this for 1 book and then completely stopped doing it. My structures have been a mess ever since. One wonders why. But yeah, good little... one of the best pieces of advice I ever got. It sounds so simple, but writer I really admire, Kitch Johnson, told me, just make a scene 700 to 1,400 words. If I could stick to that, my books would be so much better. Good rule of thumb, I think. Not one you will see a lot of, especially fantasy writers, stick to. But like so many rules, it's a good place to start.
I often wonder about that kind of structured approach to creativeness, because I think anybody that's a creative sort of wants to feel that bit of magic, if you know what I mean, when you're going through the creative, which is why it's an awful lot of free form. And if it feels like it's a formula, I think of the creative endeavors that I would do that are kind of like, oh, this can't be good because I don't, that kind of moment where you have the feeling where you splurge, like you were saying, a lot of words out, you read it back the next day. As you say, an awful lot of times you might go, that was garbage and a waste of my time. But occasionally you went to bed thinking, this was terrible. And you wake up and you go, actually, this wasn't bad in the cold light of day.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the value to me for word count guidelines like that is I know I tend to go long. So I need to have a rule of thumb about when to be like, hey, stop. Like, I make a mean apple pie, but I use the same pie plate every time. Not the same pie plate, but I use the pie plate, I'm not trying to freehand that pie. Having some boundaries can be good, and they're optional. You know why they're there. You can take them away if you want. Certainly, I have. Yeah. Should I plug my next book? that?
Please.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I have a science fiction novel called Exordia coming out in January. And this is my fun book. I wrote it between Burrow Cormorant novels to just enjoy myself. The premise is that our protagonist, Anna, is an office worker in New York City in 2013. She's just been fired. She's having an awful day, and she sees an alien in Central Park. And being a huge fuck-up and a survivor of the Anfal genocide of the Kurds, she immediately decides she's sick of her life. She wants to find out what this alien is doing and join it on whatever its mission on Earth is. And that goes to some pretty wild places. Turns out the alien is here looking for the key to understanding the universe's objective code of right and wrong, which is important to her because she is damned to go to hell. She would like to change that. Things take off from there.
That sounds cool. And January 2024, you said?
Yeah.
And what was the name again?
Exordia, EXORDIA.
And it's up for pre-order on Amazon.
I guess so, yeah.
January 23rd.
It's got a very yellow cover.
It does.
Growing up as a kid, I loved a lot of techno thrillers. I loved like Michael Crichton, and I wanted to do a book like that, but with my own notions of what was interesting. We'll see if anyone likes it. I really have no idea. It's kind of a experiment, but it's definitely more accessible than Borrow. Oh, accessible. It's more energetic, more screen friendly. I don't know.
Cool.
Nice. Yeah.
Very cool.
Pick that one up. Very nice.
Nice. So.
Yeah. So. Awesome. Well, does anyone else have any other questions before we let Seth get back to work?
I feel like I should have I should have like stock questions for wrapping up. I really got to think of some punishing moral questions to ask you guys. What? I think I think a lot about this idea of moral competence, which is something I think I see lacking in the science fiction and fantasy community, like the way people behave online. It's not the same as saying someone is good or bad. It's about having the tools to make good moral decisions in situations. Specifically what it's based on is the Milgram experiment, which unlike nearly every other science fiction, every other major psychology experiment, has not been debunked. Are you familiar with the Milgram experiment? In case listeners are not, it was a post-World War II psychological experiment where a man in a white lab coat would take volunteers into a room and be like, here's a button. There's a guy in the other room who's going to answer quiz questions. You have the right answers here, and if he gets an answer wrong, you need to give him an electrical shock by pushing this button. And the shocks will get higher and higher the more questions he gets wrong. Now, what the participant does not know is that the guy's not receiving any electrical shocks. He's an actor. And he's going to, on purpose, get some questions wrong. And the more questions he gets wrong, the more pain he's going to be in. And he's going to say he has a heart condition. And right about 70% of the way through, when he's received enough shocks, he's going to go silent. And the question of the experiment is, how many shocks are you willing to deliver to this guy? And something like a little less than half of people go all the way. They're often very uncomfortable with it. They're very upset. But the guy in the white lab coat will say, like, this is an important scientific experiment. We need you to continue. The way this was interpreted at the time was, just like the Nazis, nearly anyone can be made to like hurt or kill their neighbor as long as an authority figure is telling them to do it. But I prefer to look at the experiment as half of people had the moral competence to stop. And I don't think it's because they were better people. I don't think it's because they were, uniquely privileged to know the nature of right and wrong. I think everyone knew what they were doing. Electrocuting this guy who seemed like he was in severe pain was wrong. But not everyone could figure out a way to get over their social conditioning and their role as a, participant in an experiment to be like, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. Pretty much everybody there, I think, knew they were doing the wrong thing, but not everyone had the techniques. Just the way I don't have the technique to change the oil in my car if I had a car. I just don't know how to do that. I think teaching moral competence is really important, as something separate from just being good. And it's a difficult thing to talk about because it requires us to acknowledge that many of us can and will do bad things without necessarily being bad people. Sure, I'll just immediately pull the most horrible, scandalous example to ruin my career. But I think the conversations about consent and having verbal consent during sex are a really good example of teaching competence. They allow people to communicate clearly about things that might otherwise be left unsaid that could lead to really horrible situations. Yeah, so I guess if I want to leave on anything, it's thinking about that, about how to teach ourselves to do the right thing, even when there are so many pressures and circumstances on us to do something else. It can be very hard. I think especially on social media, The truth is we enjoy other people's pain. I don't mean that in some sadistic way. We're not sadists. It's just kind of funny when someone else is getting owned really hard on social media. Sometimes we're even quite sure they deserve it. But it's an environment where it's very easy for hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of people to dogpile one, sometimes over a misunderstanding. And even if the dogpile is 100% morally justified 90% of the time, so that makes it 90% morally justified, what about those times we fuck up and we get the wrong person? How do we make ourselves people who won't make that mistake? I think about that a lot. But, yeah.
It's the digital coliseum.
Yes.
Yeah. That's an interesting way. I haven't heard it described, but it really is, right? It's the blood sport on the internet.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes
Moral blood sport.
sometimes when Twitter or whatever is at its best, no one is hurt. If you read a funny drill tweet, I love drill. No one's being hurt by that. You're laughing at what a ridiculous person he is. But I don't know. Especially in professional communities, I think moving fan and professional communities onto social media has been a huge mistake. It has erased necessary boundaries. It has created an atmosphere of paranoia and self-policing that ironically makes the most vulnerable more vulnerable. Yeah.
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 Well said.
Well, anyway, buy my book. I hope you like the book.
Me too.
Are you guys going to be talking?
Yeah. Yeah, we'll be discussing it weekly on the podcast, and then if you'd like to join us for the final discussion, of course, we'd love to have you if you'd be willing to.
Baru is Baru, not Baru. The people with X's in their names, you can pronounce it as sh. So Sheit Yawa to get or Laishashu as a pretty good approximation. And I do not hear language. I don't have a verbal internal monologue. So if you're wondering why does Seth pull these unpronounceable names from Polish, it's because to me they're just interesting shapes on a page. I don't need to sound them out to understand them. So I apologize for that if any of the Polish-inspired names are just too much.
I don't think that's an unusual thing for fantasy fans. I feel like people who read enough fantasy get pretty used to having no idea how the hell to pronounce the names they read.
Yeah.
Yeah. But in the meantime, Seth, is there a place where people can find you, or the best place to find your work?
No, find it wherever is convenient for you. I blog. I post inane things at sethdickinson.com whenever I move to, but I really do mean they're inane. They have nothing to do with anything important. And I update 3 times a year. It does. My short stories are all linked there, though. It's Seth, S-E-T-H, Dickinson, DICKINSON.com.
Awesome, and I'll put that in the show notes below.
And you can email me from that too. I read my email because I don't get that many.
Yeah. I can confirm. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And Carl, where can people find you and your work?
You can find my work on the ebooks on Amazon, book wherever books are sold. You can find me on social media. Yeah, there's the pretty little cover there. Social media at Carl D. Albert is pretty much my handle for everything, everywhere, all at once. And yeah.
Awesome. And Layla.
Yeah, same thing. Social media and on the Page Tune forum.
Yes. And Paromita.
I can be
And
found on the
Chris.
page
You
doing
can
forum.
find me on my YouTube channel, which is just my name, if you like anything to do with books or movies. Occasionally on the Page Tune forums, or probably on a future Friday conversation if my...
Your YouTube channel is Chris?
Yeah, so it's Chris Mohan.
Chris
It's Chris.
Mohan.
It's actually just my first
okay.
name. It's just the worst branding ever. Like, I know how marketing works, but I sort of low key want to not ever be of any size or any consequence, because I've quite a public job as well. So
Chris's.
I just don't want to ever do that.
That
Yeah.
makes sense. Chris's do have very strong brand.
Well,
a lot of
a lot
Chris
of famous
power
ones.
going on.
Yeah, indeed.
Not bad. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Seth. We really appreciate your time and for hanging out with us.
I appreciate your patience.
Yeah.
Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Have a
Thank
great
you.
weekend.
Bye.
Thank you.